Beneath our feet lie ancient monuments that challenge everything we thought we knew about humanity. Massive stone chambers, perfectly aligned with the stars, built with skills that even today's engineers struggle to match. Burial sites containing artifacts that shouldn't exist for centuries. These aren't the famous pyramids or Stonehenge. These are the hidden, forgotten structures, scattered in remote valleys, buried beneath farmland, standing alone on windswept islands, built by people who left no written records, yet seemed to understand secrets of the universe we are only beginning to uncover. Tonight, we journey inside 8 of the world's most mysterious prehistoric sites, places where the impossible became reality, where every stone hints at lost knowledge, and where each discovery raises more questions than answers. Step into a world where history hides its greatest mysteries, and reality is stranger than fiction. Hidden deep in western Turkey, roughly 50 miles inland from the sparkling Aegean coast, lies the ancient city of Tralles. Today, its name is largely forgotten. Few travelers or scholars have ever walked its streets. Yet in antiquity, the Romans considered Tralles a jewel of Asia Minor, one of the wealthiest and most learned cities in the region. Columns of marble, grand forums, and Byzantine churches whisper of centuries gone by. But beneath these familiar ruins lies a far older, more mysterious legacy, structures that predate classical civilization by millennia, remnants of knowledge long lost to humanity. In 2008, a team of archaeologists working near the city's center made a discovery that stunned the world. As they dug beneath a layer of Roman concrete, their tools struck something far more ancient. What lay beneath was a colossal stone platform, nearly 200 feet in diameter. The stones were enormous, weighing 15 to 20 tons each, yet their origins were even more remarkable. Geological analysis traced the blocks to mountains over 70 miles away. No nearby quarry could account for their presence here. And the craftsmanship, stunning in its precision, defies explanation even today. These stones fit together so flawlessly that not a single credit card can be slid between them. There is no mortar, no filler, no gap, just perfectly pressed stone, aligned with tolerances measured in millimeters. Carbon dating places the construction of this platform around 3,800 BCE, firmly within the Chalcolithic period, thousands of years before bronze tools, or even iron, would have been widely available. The sheer scale, precision, and planning required to move, shape, and fit these stones is a challenge for modern engineers. But the platform is far more than a simple foundation. Channels run across its surface, carved into intricate geometric patterns that follow no known architectural tradition. These channels connect to underground chambers whose purpose remains mysterious. Step into the center of the platform and whisper. Your voice carries to every corner with astonishing clarity. Raise your voice, and the echoes build on themselves, producing harmonics that ancient instruments could never replicate. Researchers are still trying to understand the science behind these acoustic properties, and every experiment only deepens the enigma. Access to the site was officially restricted by the Turkish government in 2011, citing structural concerns. Yet insiders suggest there may be another reason. Archaeologists who worked at Tralles discovered inscriptions etched into the stones in a proto-language unknown anywhere else in Anatolia. One scholar described the symbols as mathematical notation disguised as art, hinting at knowledge far beyond what we once imagined possible for this era. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a network of tunnels radiating from the platform in 6 directions, each aimed toward other ancient sites across Anatolia. Today, these tunnels are collapsed, filled with centuries of sediment, yet their existence raises profound questions. How could people of the Bronze Age survey such distances with such precision? The nearest known site lies 18 miles away, a staggering feat for a civilization believed to lack advanced surveying tools. Local legend speaks of the teachers from the deep earth, wise figures who emerged from beneath tralleys to share knowledge with the surface world. Stories passed down through generations predate written Greek by centuries. While most academics dismiss them as myth, the discovery of the tunnels has prompted some scholars to reconsider these accounts. Could these tales preserve fragments of memory about real events, lost to history, yet encoded in oral tradition? Roman historians wrote of Tralles as a center of learning, a city of scholars who studied the stars and predicted celestial events with astonishing accuracy. They never explained where this knowledge originated. Greeks credited it to earlier, unnamed sources they called the stone builders, suggesting a lineage of wisdom that extended far beyond the familiar annals of history. Attempts to date organic materials from the chambers produced baffling results. Samples taken from the same layer yielded dates separated by as much as 3,000 years. Either the carbon dating methods failed under unknown conditions, or some unique property of the chambers has rendered conventional dating unreliable. Neither possibility provides comfort, leaving only uncertainty. The stones themselves bear evidence of intense heat exposure, not ordinary fire, but something far hotter. Certain surfaces have a glassy, vitrified quality, resembling rock struck by lightning. Yet lightning cannot strike the same geometric patterns repeatedly, nor with the deliberate precision visible across the platform. Whoever, or whatever, created this heat did so intentionally, as if shaping knowledge into the stones themselves. Modern attempts to recreate the platform have ended in failure. Teams using period-appropriate tools cannot achieve the tolerances seen at Tralles. Even advanced computer modeling and modern construction techniques fall short. The evidence suggests the builders employed some form of template or method lost to time. Whatever knowledge allowed them to accomplish such precision disappeared with them, leaving only questions carved into stone. The Turkish Department of Antiquities remains silent regarding ongoing research. The last official paper on Tralles was published in 2014. Since then, no updates have emerged. The excavation is now covered by a locked metal warehouse, designed to protect it from the elements. The building has no windows, and its doors remain closed to the public. The veil of secrecy only adds to the intrigue. What was Tralles? A temple? An observatory? A school? Or all three? The acoustic features suggest ceremonial functions. The astronomical alignments hint at advanced scientific understanding. The underground chambers imply secrecy, perhaps even forbidden knowledge. Maybe it was everything at once. Or maybe it was something for which we have no words today. One thing is certain. The people who built Tralles possessed knowledge that humanity would not independently develop for another 4,000 years. Then they vanished, leaving behind only questions etched in stone. Questions that remain unanswered, hidden beneath the Turkish countryside, and guarded by authorities who seem wary of what else may yet be uncovered. Rising like a jagged wall between the Black Sea and the Caspian, the Western Caucasus Mountains form one of the harshest landscapes in Eurasia. Steep valleys, dense forests, and winters that can freeze a man alive define this rugged terrain. Yet, hidden beneath centuries of soil, vegetation, and time itself, lie thousands of stone structures that challenge everything we know about Bronze Age engineering. These are the dolmens of the North Caucasus, silent, mysterious, and almost impossibly precise. Local legends call them the houses of the dwarves, while Russian archaeologists classify them as megalithic gallery tombs. Neither name captures their full essence or hints at the knowledge required to build them. The first systematic study began in 1818, after Russian forces secured the region. Military surveyors documented over 300 dolmens in just 1 year. By 1900, that number had grown to nearly 3,000. Today, scholars estimate that 7,000 or more remain undiscovered, hidden deep in remote valleys and on windswept peaks. Each dolmen follows a strikingly consistent design. 4 massive vertical slabs form the walls. A 5th slab serves as the roof, while a 6th seals the back. The front wall features a perfectly circular hole, usually 16 inches in diameter, often covered with a carved stone plug that fits flawlessly. The stones themselves weigh between 15 and 30 tons, sculpted from sandstone, granite, or limestone depending on local availability. Their surfaces are polished smooth, corners meet at exact right angles, and the precision of assembly is so extraordinary that modern engineers still struggle to replicate it. Consider this: these structures were built between 4,000 and 2,500 BCE. Bronze tools were scarce, iron was millennia away, and yet these people shaped and positioned enormous stones with tolerances that match modern machine work. Microscopic analysis of the circular entrance holes reveals rotational marks, evidence of some kind of rotary cutting device. Technology that, as far as the archaeological record shows, wouldn't appear for another 3,000 years. The dolmens are not placed randomly. Lines of structures follow ridgelines and watercourses. Clusters are found atop peaks or along strategic valleys. Some appear in spiral arrangements spanning nearly 2 miles, such as the 43 dolmens near the Shada River. Their alignments are precise, often within a few degrees, suggesting a knowledge of surveying, geometry, and perhaps astronomy that seems far beyond what we expect from Bronze Age communities. Excavations by Soviet archaeologists between 1950 and 1985 only deepened the mystery. Yes, some dolmens contained human remains, but rarely complete skeletons. Bones were sometimes added centuries after construction. Artifacts within the chambers confounded researchers, pottery fragments predating the dolmens by 1,000 years, tools from distant cultures, bronze items that should not have existed in that era. One dolmen near Gelendzhik contained a copper spiral, identical to designs found in Celtic Ireland, separated by 3,000 miles and 800 years. The acoustic properties of the dolmens are equally remarkable. In 1983, a Moscow University team tested 12 chambers, discovering that each amplified certain frequencies while dampening others. The stones resonate at approximately 110 Hz, a frequency known to influence human consciousness. Stand inside, hum at the correct pitch, and the entire structure vibrates. Could these chambers have been designed for ceremonial purposes, for meditation, or even for altered states of awareness? Legends attribute the dolmens to giants, beings capable of softening stone with their hands. Folklore, of course, but geological analysis adds a curious twist. Compression patterns in the stone do not match any known cutting or grinding techniques. Mineral structures are altered in ways modern petrologists struggle to explain, as if the builders manipulated matter itself. Some dolmens contain inscriptions, rare, 1 in every 50. The symbols are geometric, precise, and almost mathematical. Russian linguist Vladimir Degtyarev spent 3 decades attempting to decipher them. Before his death in 2003, he claimed they represented star charts, a cosmic language of ancient observers. His findings, however, were never formally published. The Russian government designated the dolmen fields as protected archaeological zones in 1960. Access is technically restricted, but enforcement is inconsistent in the remote valleys. Local guides will lead visitors to some sites for a fee, yet others remain strictly off-limits. One dolmen near the village of Volkonka stands apart. Built from red granite not found locally, larger than any nearby structure, and sealed with a stone plug weighing over 2 tons, it bears a symbol unlike any other in the Caucasus, a spiral enclosed within a perfect circle. Locals claim it sings during earthquakes, producing a low hum audible for miles. In 1992, a Russian research team spent 3 weeks at this very site, equipped with seismographs and electronic instruments. They recorded strange electromagnetic fluctuations, compasses spun erratically, and some devices malfunctioned. On the final day, a researcher named Dmitry Kozlov entered the chamber to place sensors. 12 minutes later, he emerged disoriented, unable to speak coherently. He recovered physically, but refused to describe what he experienced. The team abandoned further study. Modern theories attempt to explain the dolmens, ranging from mundane to extraordinary. Some suggest burial tombs. Others propose birthing chambers designed for ritual or acoustic purposes, and a few speculate they were resonance devices in a communication network spanning the mountains. Yet none of these theories fully account for the precision, the alignments, or the effort required to move 30-ton stones across extreme terrain to construct thousands of identical chambers over 150 miles of mountainside. What knowledge did these people possess? Knowledge that vanished without a trace. The builders of the North Caucasus dolmens demonstrated engineering, acoustical, and astronomical understanding that would not reappear in human civilization for thousands of years. They left no cities, no written records, no lasting cultural artifacts beyond these silent stone structures. Instead, they left questions that remain unanswered, lingering in the wind-swept valleys and shadowed forests of the Caucasus 5,000 years later. Sardinia rises from the heart of the Mediterranean like a fortress of stone, a land steeped in mystery and ancient history. As the second-largest island in the sea, it is known for its thousands of nuraghi, distinctive cone-shaped towers that dominate the landscape. Yet scattered among these well-known monuments are even older, far more enigmatic structures, built a millennium before the nuraghi ever appeared. The locals call them Tomba dei Giganti, the tombs of the giants. These are not tombs in the conventional sense. They are massive stone galleries, some stretching over 90 feet in length. Their facades rise 15 feet high, composed of enormous slabs arranged in a distinctive arc. A central stele, flanked by curved wings. The design is unlike anything else in ancient architecture. At the base of the central stone lies a small opening, barely 2 feet high, just enough for a person to crawl through. Yet despite their modest entrance, the impact of these structures is monumental. Over 300 tombs have been identified across Sardinia, most dating to the Bronze Age between 2000 and 1800 BCE. Yet a few are far older. The tomb at Kodu Vecchiu, near Arzachena, demonstrates techniques unseen elsewhere on the island. The stones are larger, the joints tighter, and carbon dating of organic materials inside suggests construction as early as 3500 BCE, placing it firmly in the Chalcolithic period. Medieval legend gave these tombs their name. Sardinians believed they held the bones of ancient giants who ruled the island long before humans arrived. When archaeologists first excavated the sites in the 1800s, they did indeed find human remains, dozens of skeletons in each tomb. But what they discovered raised as many questions as it answered. The remains were meticulously prepared. Bones were defleshed, cleaned, and arranged in the galleries with careful organization, skulls in one area, long bones in another. Some tombs contain bones from over 100 individuals. This was no casual burial. The care and precision suggest a purpose beyond simply disposing of the dead. In front of each tomb's facade lies a semicircular plaza paved with flat stones. Archaeologists found evidence of repeated activity here, where patterns, fire pits, pottery fragments, and animal bones suggest these areas were used for ceremonial gatherings, feasts, or rituals. But there is more than archaeology to suggest the extraordinary. In 2007, researchers from the University of Cagliari conducted electromagnetic surveys across 12 tomb sites. They discovered subtle but consistent magnetic anomalies in front of the facades. Follow-up studies by physicists revealed that the stones themselves contained high concentrations of magnetite. Crucially, the builders had deliberately selected the most magnetic stones for the facades, while using less magnetic stone for the rest of the structure. Why? One theory connects this with human perception of electromagnetic fields. Exposure to certain magnetic frequencies is known to influence the nervous system, producing vivid dreams, altered states of consciousness, and experiences described as spiritual or mystical. It is possible the tombs were intentionally designed to induce these effects, an interaction between architecture, geology, and human physiology that is centuries ahead of its time. The interiors tell an equally compelling story. The galleries are oriented east-west, with entrances facing the rising sun. During the winter solstice, sunlight penetrates deep into the chambers, illuminating walls carved with spiral motifs. These spirals become visible only at specific angles of light, echoing designs found across megalithic Europe, from Ireland to Malta. Cultures supposedly isolated from one another appear to have shared a common artistic or symbolic language. In 1982, archaeologists excavating the tomb at Lilolgi uncovered an object that seemed impossible, a small, intricately crafted bronze item, showing metallurgical techniques not expected in Sardinia for another 5 centuries. Analysis revealed the bronze contained tin sourced from Britain, over 1,000 miles away. Traditional explanations suggest long-distance trade, but this does not account for a 3,500 BCE tomb containing metalwork from a culture that had yet to exist. Local traditions tell of the first people, ancestral figures who crossed the sea, bringing knowledge of stone, stars, and the cosmos. These teachers were said to share wisdom with the islanders before vanishing without a trace. Legends across the Mediterranean echo similar tales, often dismissed as myth. But the archaeological record suggests there may be more truth to these stories than previously imagined. The tombs were reused over centuries. Later, cultures added burials and performed ceremonies, yet they never altered the original structures. Respect, or perhaps fear, kept the builders' intent intact for millennia. Modern Sardinians report strange experiences near these tombs, sensations of being watched, electronics malfunctioning, sudden temperature drops of 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and low-frequency humming. These reports are remarkably consistent across sites. In 2015, the Italian government restricted access to several tombs after an incident at Serra Orios. A group of tourists reported disorientation, nausea, and seeing geometric patterns while inside a smaller tomb. All five heard low humming, and no physical explanation was found. What were these tombs really for? Burial seems only part of the story. Magnetic properties, precise acoustic design, astronomical alignments, and ceremonial plazas suggest multiple purposes. Perhaps these were places where the living communed with the dead, or where initiates sought experiences beyond the ordinary. The builders of the tombs of the giants possess knowledge we are only beginning to comprehend. They understood Earth's magnetic fields, stone resonance, acoustics, and human consciousness in ways that seem almost supernatural. They encoded this wisdom in structures that have survived 5,000 years, silent yet potent. And yet, the greatest mystery remains. Why? Why invest such effort, knowledge, and planning into these monuments? Why endure millennia of exposure to wind, sea, and time to preserve effects that continue to challenge scientists, historians, and visitors alike? The answers remain locked within Sardinia's stone giants, waiting for those brave enough to seek them. The high desert of New Mexico is unforgiving. Summers scorch, with temperatures exceeding 100 degrees, while winter nights plunge below freezing. Water is scarce, and the soil is thin and poor. It is hardly the place one would expect to find the ruins of a sophisticated civilization. Yet, tucked deep within a remote canyon, far from any reliable water source, stand the remains of a society that defies explanation. Chaco Canyon. Between 850 and 1150 CE, the ancestral Puebloans transformed this desolate landscape into a metropolis of monumental stone structures. The largest of these, Pueblo Bonito, contained over 600 rooms and rose 4 stories high. The walls, constructed from precisely cut sandstone blocks, were layered in patterns that continue to baffle modern architects. The scale of the construction is staggering. These were not ordinary dwellings. They were great houses, meticulously engineered, with millions of sandstone pieces, each shaped to fit its precise location. Over 200,000 wooden beams, ponderosa pine and spruce, were transported from forests 50 miles away, carried across desert terrain, without wheels, horses, or metal tools. And yet, the environment posed a fundamental challenge. Chaco Canyon could not sustain a large population. Estimates suggest the great houses could have accommodated thousands, but environmental studies indicate the canyon could barely support a few hundred year-round residents. How, then, could such a monumental effort be justified in a place that could not support a city? Some researchers point to the roads. The ancestral Puebloans built over 400 miles of roads radiating from Chaco Canyon, cut straight across the landscape. These were not simple trails. They were 30 feet wide, graded flat, and lined with berms. When roads encountered cliffs, stairways were carved into the rock. When crossing mesas, they maintained their perfect trajectory, regardless of the terrain. Some roads ended at seemingly random natural features, a spring, a rock formation, or a hilltop, while others connected to smaller outlier communities scattered across 70,000 square miles. Aerial photography revealed an even stranger truth. The roads form complex geometric patterns. Lines intersect at precise angles, aligning with specific points on the horizon. Their purpose was not efficiency. They were designed according to a logic we still do not fully understand. The Chacons were also master astronomers. Pueblo Bonito aligns with the summer and winter solstices, while windows frame the equinoxes. On Fajada Butte, three carefully placed stone slabs create a sun dagger, marking solstices and equinoxes with astonishing accuracy. Discovered in 1977, this phenomenon had functioned unnoticed for over 1,000 years. Celestial alignments extended beyond the sun. Researcher Anna Sofer mapped the canyon extensively and found that major structures correspond to the 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle, the maximum northern and southern points of moonrise. Western science did not recognize this cycle until the 18th century, yet the Chacons incorporated it into their architecture 9 centuries earlier. The architecture itself contains puzzling features: sealed rooms, thick walls far beyond structural necessity, and wooden beams arranged in patterns unknown to conventional building techniques suggest purposes beyond habitation. One room in Pueblo Bonito amplifies sound through its stone walls, hinting at sophisticated knowledge of acoustics. These were not ordinary homes. They were multifunctional spaces, possibly ceremonial, observational, or educational. Artifacts add to the mystery. Archaeologists have found thousands of turquoise pieces, beads, pendants, and inlays, some from local sources, others from mines over 200 miles away. Turquoise was rarely displayed. Instead, it was carefully buried in walls and floors, implying symbolic or ritual significance. Cylindrical pottery jars discovered in the canyon contain traces of cacao, chocolate. Cacao does not grow near Chaco Canyon. The nearest source lies over 1,000 miles south in Mexico. This indicates vast trade networks, but it also raises questions. Who drank chocolate in this desert, and why? By 1150 CE, the Chacons abandoned the canyon. The reasons remain uncertain. Evidence of warfare is absent. Tree ring studies point to a severe drought beginning around 1130, but the Chacons had endured previous dry periods. The exodus may have been gradual, yet it was definitive. Whatever purpose drove centuries of labor vanished with them. Many scholars now suggest Chaco Canyon was never intended as a city. Instead, it may have been a ceremonial hub, a pilgrimage center where people from across the Southwest gathered for specific events or rituals. The roads functioned as processional pathways rather than commercial routes. The astronomical alignments, sealed rooms, and acoustical spaces support this theory. Yet even this explanation leaves many questions unanswered. Why bury turquoise in such abundance? Why design acoustics that manipulate sound in precise ways? Why construct such elaborate structures in a location so hostile to sustained habitation? Modern Pueblo peoples, descendants of the Chacawans, still regard the canyon as sacred. When asked about its secrets, their response is often silence. Certain ceremonies continue, though details are closely guarded. Even today, some areas are restricted, requiring multiple permissions for research rarely granted. The Chacons were extraordinary engineers and astronomers. They understood the lunar cycle, built roads with perfect straightness across vast distances, and created structures with advanced acoustic properties. They coordinated labor across 70,000 square miles, all without any written language as we know it. Yet after centuries of activity, they simply left, leaving the great houses empty, the roads mostly buried, and their knowledge locked within the canyon's stones. And so, Chaco Canyon remains one of North America's greatest enigmas. Its roads, great houses, and celestial alignments testify to a civilization far more sophisticated than previously imagined. The questions endure. What knowledge did they possess, and what purpose drove them to create such a monumental, yet ultimately abandoned, legacy? The answers are buried, silent, in stone walls and desert sands, waiting for those who dare to seek them. Ireland's Hill of Tara rises gently from the rolling countryside, about 20 miles northwest of Dublin. To the untrained eye, it might seem unremarkable, a grass-covered hill with faint earthworks, a feature one could pass without noticing. But Tara was once the seat of Irish high kings, a centre of power and ritual spanning centuries. And hidden atop this hill is something far older than any king, the Mound of the Hostages. This passage tomb dates back to around 3200 BCE, making it older than the pyramids of Egypt, older than Stonehenge, and older than written language. Its passage extends just 13 feet into the mound, modest in size, yet what lies within challenges everything we thought we knew about Neolithic Ireland. The tomb's name comes from later Irish mythology. Stories claim that hostages were held here during medieval times, taken from nobles or rival clans. But these tales emerged 3,000 years after the tomb's construction. Its original builders were Neolithic farmers, seemingly simple people, but the evidence suggests anything but simplicity. The entrance is aligned with the sunrise on Samhain and Imbolc, corresponding to November 1st and February 1st in the modern calendar. These dates marked the traditional Celtic division between summer and winter, light and dark. At sunrise on these days, sunlight penetrates the passage and illuminates the chamber with remarkable precision, accurate to within half a degree. Consider the challenge. The Hill of Tara has been continuously occupied for over 5,000 years. The landscape has been reshaped repeatedly, earthworks added, ditches dug, structures built and demolished. Yet the Mound of the Hostages maintains its original alignment. Whoever designed it accounted for the future, compensating for changes that would come long after their time. Inside the chamber, archaeologists found remains of over 200 individuals. Most were cremated, their ashes placed in pottery vessels and layered within the tomb. But several burials were inhumations, complete bodies laid with careful attention. Carbon dating reveals that these burials span nearly 2,000 years, showing that the tomb was reused across generations. One burial is particularly striking: a teenage boy adorned with a necklace of jet and bronze. Jet, fossilized wood, was sourced from Yorkshire, England. Bronze should not have existed in Ireland in 3200 BCE. It would not arrive for another millennium. Yet here it was, in one of the earliest layers of the tomb. The chamber walls are decorated with spirals, lozenges, and zigzag patterns, the hallmark of Neolithic art across Western Europe. But unlike typical decorative carvings, these motifs were designed to interact with sunlight. During Samhain, as light enters the passage, the carvings come alive, their patterns emerging from shadow in a precise dance of illumination. In 1994, researchers conducted a mathematical analysis of the carvings. They discovered something extraordinary. The patterns were not random. They followed geometric rules, ratios, and sequences, golden ratios, Fibonacci sequences, and other relationships that Western mathematics would not formalize for another 3,000 years. Some argue this is coincidence, but the consistency across multiple stones makes chance improbable. Someone understood these mathematical principles and encoded them deliberately. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed anomalies beneath the mound, voids and chambers that should not exist according to the known structure. Excavation is limited by Ireland's National Monuments Act, but radar shows at least 3 subterranean chambers arranged in a triangular pattern around the main passage, hinting at a larger, hidden network of spaces. Local legend speaks of the Tuatha De Danann, a mythical race said to have ruled Ireland before the Celts. They were master builders and magicians, able to shape the land and move massive stones at will. Historians often dismiss these stories as fantasy, yet every myth contains a kernel of truth. The Mound of the Hostages suggests that its builders possessed knowledge far beyond what we might expect from Neolithic farmers. In 1968, a farmer ploughing near the mound struck a buried stone slab. Archaeologists found a secondary passage extending 30 feet before collapsing. The walls were carved with geometric patterns similar to those in the main chamber. The government ordered the passage reburied, citing structural stability. No formal excavation followed. Witnesses to the discovery reported symbols resembling a proto-alphabet, entirely unknown and undecipherable. The Mound of the Hostages sits at the center of a much larger complex. Tara contains over 30 visible monuments, ring forts, standing stones, earthworks, most dating to the Iron Age or later. Yet aerial surveys reveal older structures beneath these later constructions, circular crop marks, linear features arranged in geometric patterns. Central planning seems evident. The mound was the anchor point, spatially and geometrically guiding everything built afterward. Why here? Tara occupies the geographic center of Ireland. Its east-west and north-south midpoints intersect within a few hundred yards of the mound. This may be coincidence, but similar Neolithic sites across Europe demonstrate careful attention to site selection. The builders understood how to integrate landscape, astronomy, and geometry into a single, coherent plan. Even today, modern Druids perform ceremonies at the mound during traditional Celtic festivals. They claim the site retains spiritual power and that the earth itself vibrates with energy. Magnetometer studies confirm unusual readings around the entrance, consistent anomalies, subtle but persistent, unlike the surrounding terrain. The builders of the Mound of the Hostages were exceptional. They aligned the tomb with astronomical precision, encoded advanced mathematics into stone carvings, and engineered a structure that has survived over 5 millennia of Ireland's harsh climate. And yet, they left no written records, no inscriptions explaining their purpose, no manuals, only stones, aligned, carved, and hidden, containing knowledge that vanished with them, leaving future generations to puzzle over their intentions and wonder what else they knew that we have yet to rediscover. Central Turkey's Anatolian plateau stretches endlessly, windswept, flat, and largely desolate. About 90 miles east of Ankara lies a small, unassuming village called Alaka. Most travelers pass through without a glance. Yet just outside this village, beneath centuries of soil and debris, rests one of the most enigmatic and mysterious sites in the ancient world, Alaka Huyuk. At first glance, the site seems unimpressive. A tell, an artificial mound formed by successive generations building atop the ruins of their predecessors. The surface is dominated by Hittite structures from around 1700 BCE. But in 1935, Turkish archaeologists dug below these Hittite layers and discovered something that utterly reshaped our understanding of Bronze Age Anatolia. 13 royal tombs dating to roughly 2500 BCE, a millennium before the Hittites, before any named civilization in the region. These tombs contained remains of men and women buried with extraordinary wealth: gold, silver, and bronze objects crafted with techniques that should not have existed at the time. Yet it wasn't the metals themselves that astonished researchers. It was the sun discs, 8 bronze discs, ranging from 8 to 24 inches in diameter, each displaying intricate openwork designs, geometric patterns surrounding a central solar motif. The metalwork is impossibly delicate, thin bronze, shaped into filigree so precise it resembles lace. These discs were mounted on poles, likely carried in religious processions. But the casting techniques required to produce such objects weren't developed in Anatolia until centuries later. Chemical analysis revealed the bronze contained arsenic, a deliberate alloy to increase hardness and allow for finer detail. Someone in 2500 BCE possessed an advanced understanding of metallurgy, deliberately tailoring their materials for specific purposes. The sophistication of these techniques suggests a highly developed metalworking tradition. Yet there is no evidence of how this knowledge emerged or where it came from. The tombs also contain ceremonial standards, poles topped with bulls, stags, and solar discs. One standard depicts a bull with inlaid silver details. The horns and hooves were cast separately and then attached. The joints are so seamless they are almost invisible to the naked eye. Modern craftsmen would struggle to replicate such perfection. Some artifacts defy categorization entirely. Flat bronze grids with geometric cutouts, spherical objects covered in raised bosses, a cage-like bronze piece with no clear function. These items were neither tools nor weapons, nor merely decorative. Their purpose remains unknown, perhaps deliberately enigmatic. DNA analysis from 2019 adds another layer of mystery. The people buried in these tombs were not closely related to later Anatolian populations. Their genetic markers suggest origins in the Caucasus region, possibly combined with populations from further east. They were outsiders, immigrants or conquerors, who arrived with wealth and technology far beyond what existed locally. Sacrificial burials accompany the human remains, usually oxen, sometimes sheep or dogs. These animals were not simply food offerings. They were arranged in precise positions around the tombs. Numbers are always even, multiples of 2 or 4, demonstrating deliberate symmetry and ritual planning. One tomb, designated Tomb H, contained the remains of a woman buried with over 500 objects: gold jewelry, silver vessels, bronze implements, and ceramic jars. The sheer volume indicates immense wealth, but also suggests a belief in an afterlife requiring material provisions. The community clearly regarded death as a transition necessitating preparedness. The settlement of Alakahuyuk was small, estimated at perhaps 2,000 inhabitants. Yet this small population produced metalwork rivaling Mesopotamia, the acknowledged cradle of Bronze Age civilization. How could such a modest town develop techniques of such sophistication? Trade may explain some wealth. The site sits along routes connecting the Black Sea with central Anatolia, but trade alone does not explain the sudden emergence of highly advanced metallurgical knowledge. Someone brought it here, or perhaps they discovered it on their own. The site shows evidence of destruction around 2000 BCE. The settlement burned, the tombs were sealed, and the knowledge of their creators vanished. When the Hittites arrived 7 centuries later, they built atop these earlier layers, apparently unaware of the secrets buried beneath. The techniques and traditions that created the bronze sun discs disappeared with their makers. Fortification walls from the pre-Hittite period survive, constructed of massive stones, some weighing several tons, fitted without mortar. The defensive perimeter encloses roughly 12 acres, a considerable fortification for a modest settlement. Were they defending against invaders or protecting sacred knowledge? In 1997, Turkish authorities restricted access to portions of the site. Officially, this was to preserve fragile structures. But archaeologists who worked there prior to the restrictions reported inscriptions, not cuneiform nor Hittite script, but an older, unknown writing system. Photographs were taken, but remain classified. The secrecy surrounding these finds hints at knowledge deemed too valuable or too dangerous for public release. Local villagers refer to Alakahöyük as the place of the Sun People. Their stories speak of ancient kings capable of shaping metal like clay, who understood the cycles of stars and seasons. Remarkably, these legends predate the discovery of the sun disks by generations. How did local memory preserve this knowledge? Hittite records mention Alakahöyük, known to them as Arina, as a sacred city, seat of the sun goddess. They conducted festivals and made offerings at temples, but never recorded the tombs beneath the surface. Perhaps they did not know, or perhaps the knowledge was deliberately concealed. What is publicly visible today is impressive, but represents only a fraction of what was found. Many artifacts remain in storage, catalogued but unseen. Some items have never been photographed or published. Scholars requesting access are often denied. The Turkish government guards these objects meticulously, maintaining a barrier between modern eyes and ancient secrets. The people buried in Alakahöyük possessed knowledge humanity would not independently redevelop for another millennium. They understood advanced alloying, casting, and metalworking techniques that would not become widespread until the Iron Age. They created objects of extraordinary artistry, encoding knowledge into bronze, gold, and silver. Then they disappeared. The sun disks still gleam as they did 4,500 years ago, yet the civilization that produced them vanished, leaving only questions. Who were these sun people? Where did they come from? Where did they go? And what secrets lie buried beneath Anatolia, still sealed beneath layers of soil and centuries of silence? The island of Gotland rises from the Baltic Sea, about 60 miles off Sweden's eastern coast, like a solitary sentinel. Its landscape tells a story of human habitation spanning more than 8,000 years. Medieval churches dot rolling hills. Viking picture stones stand scattered across fields. Yet hidden among these familiar markers of history are monuments far older. Stone constructions built by people whose names and stories have vanished into the fog of prehistory. The largest of these ancient structures lies near the village of Ansava. This massive megalithic grave mound stretches over 100 feet across and rises nearly 20 feet high. Its perimeter is marked by enormous limestone slabs, quarried from locations miles away, each weighing several tons. For a Neolithic community, constructing such a monument would have required thousands of man-hours, an extraordinary investment of labor and planning. Swedish archaeologists first excavated Ansava in 1896. What they uncovered challenged conventional understanding. The mound was not built all at once. It grew in stages over centuries, possibly millennia. Successive generations added layers, each burial accompanied by objects that reflected its era. The deepest layers date to around 3,500 BCE, while the latest additions were made as late as 500 BCE, 3,000 years of continuous use, a cemetery that spanned generations, civilizations, and millennia. It is the earliest burials that astonish. These first occupants were interred with polished stone axes and amber beads, standard Neolithic grave goods. Yet they also possessed copper objects, small spirals, tubes, and decorative items showcasing advanced metalworking. According to conventional archaeological timelines, copper technology reached Scandinavia only around 2800 BCE. And yet here it was, present 7 centuries too early. Initial skepticism attributed this anomaly to contamination. Perhaps later, objects had mixed with older layers, but the stratigraphy was intact, undisturbed. Carbon dating confirmed the early dates. Someone on Gotland had access to copper in 3500 BCE, long before it should have arrived. The mound also contained objects even stranger than copper, perfectly round stone spheres, roughly the size of a grapefruit, intricately carved with geometric designs. Similar spheres appear across Neolithic northern Europe, from Scotland to Poland. Their purpose remains a mystery. Some suggest ritual significance, others propose astronomical or calendrical uses. Modern analysis confirms that these spheres are geometrically precise, accurate to within a few millimeters. To shape stone into such a form by hand requires patience, skill, and an understanding of geometry, skills that seem disproportionately advanced for the small, remote communities of the Baltic. The arrangement of the mound itself hints at astronomical knowledge. Stones surrounding the perimeter align with the rising positions of the sun and moon at key moments of the year, solstices, equinoxes, and cross-quarter days. The builders effectively created a stone calendar, tracking celestial movements with remarkable precision, reflecting observations accumulated over generations. In 1974, researchers discovered another layer of complexity. The mound sits at the center of a network of similar megalithic sites across southern Gotland. Drawing lines between these structures reveals deliberate geometric patterns, triangles, parallelograms, and alignments that cannot be attributed to chance. Whoever built them understood both landscape and mathematics, arranging their monuments with intent and planning lost to time. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2008 revealed previously unknown chambers within the mound, voids left intentionally in the construction, not the result of collapse. Some are small, coffin-sized, others are larger, room-sized. These spaces remain unopened, their contents hidden from archaeologists by government restrictions. Whatever lies inside may hold keys to understanding the site, but for now, they are sealed, enigmatic, and untouchable. Local legend speaks of the first builders, a race of giants who constructed Gotland's ancient monuments before the Swedes arrived. These stories describe masters of stone and metal, wise and powerful, who eventually sailed east across the Baltic when the climate changed. Initially dismissed as folklore, these legends gain credibility when juxtaposed with the anomalous copper objects, suggesting contact with cultures far to the east, in the steppes of Russia and Ukraine, where copper metallurgy emerged early. Modern digs on Gotland continue to reveal surprises. A 2015 excavation near Frøyel uncovered pottery with designs matching those from the Black Sea region, dating to 3200 BCE. This implies long-distance contact over 1,000 miles of sea, an impressive feat for a society often assumed to be insular and primitive. The island's modern inhabitants report strange phenomena near the ancient mounds: compass needles spinning erratically, magnetic anomalies, electronic devices malfunctioning without explanation. These occurrences are sporadic but consistent, hinting at forces or materials embedded in the stones themselves that remain unexplained by contemporary science. Despite extensive cataloguing and partial excavation, much about the megalithic grave mound at Ansave remains unknown. We know its size, roughly when it was constructed, and that it served as a burial site. But why it was built here, in this specific design, with such extraordinary precision and with objects appearing centuries before their time, remains a mystery. The unopened chambers guard secrets that may forever elude our understanding. The builders left no written records. No inscriptions explain their purpose. The knowledge that guided their construction has vanished with the people who created it. For 5,000 years, the mound has stood silent, a sentinel over its own mysteries. The stones whisper of ancient mastery, long-lost technologies, and the capacity of human ingenuity to flourish, even in the remote corners of the Baltic Sea. Gotland's megalithic grave mound challenges every assumption we have about prehistoric Europe. It is a monument to human skill, observation, and ambition, a testament to knowledge that modern archaeology can measure but cannot fully comprehend. And in its shadow, one cannot help but wonder, who were the first builders? What did they know? And what truths remain locked inside their stones? The Orkney Islands rise from the northern seas of Scotland, scattered across cold, storm-lashed waters where the Atlantic collides with the North Sea. Trees struggle to grow here. The wind is relentless. Yet for more than 5,000 years, humans have made this harsh landscape their home. Stone circles, Neolithic villages, Viking settlements. Orkney is thick with the footprints of history. And then there are the Brochs. Brochs are among Scotland's deepest architectural mysteries. Massive stone towers, hollow-walled and built without mortar. They appear across northern Scotland and the islands, over 500 in total. Most date to the Iron Age, roughly 400 BCE to 200 CE. Each follows the same fundamental design: circular walls rising 30 feet or more, tapering slightly toward the top. Yet no two are identical, and none fully reveal the secrets of their construction. The Broch of Gurness sits on Orkney's northwestern coast, overlooking the relentless sea. It is one of the largest and best-preserved examples. Surrounding the main tower is a village of stone houses and defensive ditches, evidence of a long-lived, organized settlement. Archaeologists found traces of habitation spanning nearly 800 years. But the tower itself is the real enigma. Its walls are double-layered, two concentric shells of stone, separated by a gap containing galleries, chambers, and a spiral staircase carved within. This hollow-wall construction is unique, unseen anywhere else in the ancient world. The engineering is astonishing. Dry stacked stones, perfectly aligned, support a structure originally reaching 40 feet. Without mortar, without cement, without modern tools, the tower stands defiant against centuries of North Atlantic storms. Winds regularly exceed 100 miles per hour. Waves crash onto the shore with immense force. And still, the Broch endures. The secret lies in precision. Stones are cut to fit perfectly, distributing weight across neighboring blocks. The walls are slightly elliptical, following a geometric plan that maximizes stability. This was not trial and error. Whoever built Gurness understood principles of physics and mathematics sophisticated enough to rival modern construction theory. Inside the Broch, Traces of daily life appear: hearths, pottery fragments, animal bones. Yet the interior layout is puzzling. Massive stone piers and partitions occupy the ground floor, serving no obvious functional purpose. They neither support the upper levels nor create separate rooms. One theory proposes these piers act as acoustic devices. Standing at the center, a normal voice carries clearly to every gallery. A whisper can be heard throughout the hollow walls. The tower may have been designed as much for communication or ritual as for shelter. The surrounding village adds another layer of mystery. Houses are arranged in concentric rings, aligned with geometric precision. Each follows a standardized floor plan and orientation. Most Iron Age settlements in Scotland grew organically, without centralized planning. Gurnus suggests deliberate design, a community built to follow specific unseen principles. Defensive ditches complicate the story. 3 deep trenches, carved from solid bedrock, surround the tower. The effort required was immense, yet Orkney was not known for large-scale warfare. These formidable defenses imply either extreme caution or reverence for some unseen threat, perhaps symbolic as much as practical. Carbon dating at Gurnus produces anomalies. Samples from the same occupation layer often vary by 2 or 3 centuries. In most sites, this indicates contamination, but at Gurnus, the discrepancies are systematic. It suggests repeated abandonment and reoccupation, or some unknown, cyclical use of the site. Artifacts deepen the mystery. Roman pottery and glass beads appear centuries before the first recorded Roman expeditions to Orkney. Pictish-style carvings predate the Picts themselves. It seems the Broch's occupants had knowledge, access, or connections far beyond what conventional history allows. By 200 CE, the Broch of Gurnus and its neighbors were abandoned. The Broch building tradition ceased, and with it, the sophisticated engineering knowledge disappeared. Attempts to understand Broch construction using modern engineering reveal the staggering truth. The mathematics and spatial planning required are beyond what Iron Age societies are thought to have possessed. Computer models suggest the towers should have collapsed under their own weight, but they did not. Some researchers theorize the builders employed a lost system of geometric measurement, a form of applied mathematics transmitted orally or through practical teaching, now vanished. We have no records, no manuals, no written blueprints, only the stone itself, enduring as both monument and puzzle. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed anomalies beneath the surrounding fields, hinting at chambers or structures extending the Broch beyond what is visible. These areas remain largely inaccessible, restricted by government preservation laws. Whatever secrets lie beneath may never see the light of day. Who were the builders of Gurnus? We label them Iron Age Scots or Proto-Picts, but these are modern classifications, not identities. Their language, beliefs, and cultural knowledge remain largely unknown. What we can say is this: they understood engineering, acoustics, geometry, and community planning at a level that has baffled generations of archaeologists. And then, as abruptly as it appeared, that knowledge vanished. The Broch of Gurnus now stands silent, its stone walls still perfect after 2,000 years, enduring storms, wind, and time. It is a testament to human ingenuity, a monument to lost knowledge, and a puzzle that continues to challenge everything we think we know about ancient societies. Inside those hollow walls, in the spiral staircases and echoing galleries, the ghosts of engineering mastery whisper across the centuries, an invitation to wonder, to speculate, and to marvel at what was once possible. The desert heat shimmers above the sand dunes of Al Ain, in the United Arab Emirates. Tourists come here for the oases. Archaeologists come for something far older. Beneath the palms and dust lies Hilli Archaeological Park, a Bronze Age settlement that shouldn't exist. It's roughly 5,000 years old, and it represents one of the most sophisticated cultures of its time in one of the least forgiving environments on Earth. The centerpiece is Hilli Grand Tomb, a circular stone structure, nearly 40 feet across, covered in carvings of animals and human figures. It's called a tomb, but it's more than that. It's a statement, a declaration carved into limestone. We were here. We thrived. Inside, archaeologists found the remains of hundreds of individuals. Not scattered, not random, organized. This was a communal burial site used over generations, which means one thing: continuity. The people of Hilli didn't just survive, they built a society that lasted. But here's what doesn't add up. The Arabian Peninsula in 3000 BCE was brutal. Temperatures soared above 120 degrees. Water was scarce. Agriculture was nearly impossible. Yet Hilli had irrigation systems. They had trade networks stretching to Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. They worked bronze, crafted pottery, and built structures that required serious planning. Where did they learn this? The prevailing theory is that Hilli was part of the al-Nar culture, named after an island off the coast of Abu Dhabi. These were maritime people, skilled in trade, who moved goods and ideas across the Persian Gulf. The tombs at Hilli match those found on al-Nar Island. Same circular design, same communal burials. But that just raises another question. How did a seafaring culture establish such a strong inland presence in one of the driest regions on the planet? Some researchers point to the ancient Falaj system, underground aqueducts that tapped into aquifers and delivered water across long distances. Evidence suggests these systems were in use around Hilli. If true, it means they understood hydrology at a level that rivals much later civilizations. Others argue the region wasn't always this dry. Paleoclimatic studies suggest the Arabian Peninsula experienced wetter periods around 5,000 years ago. Perhaps Hilli wasn't built in a desert at all, but in a landscape that could sustain life more easily. Still, that doesn't explain the craftsmanship. The carvings on Hilli Grand Tomb aren't crude. They're detailed, animals in motion, human figures with distinct features. This isn't the work of struggling nomads. This is art, which means surplus, which means stability. And then there's the bronze. Bronze requires copper and tin. Copper was available locally, mined from the nearby Hajar Mountains. But tin had to be imported, possibly from as far as Afghanistan or Central Asia. That's not a simple trade route. That's an organized, long-distance supply chain. For a culture we barely knew existed 30 years ago, that's extraordinary. Excavations at Hilli also uncovered evidence of domesticated animals, wheat, barley, and date cultivation. They weren't just surviving. They were farming in a way that suggests knowledge passed down over generations. But here's where the story gets even stranger. Around 2000 BCE, Hilli was abandoned, not destroyed, not burned, just left. The people vanished. The tombs remained. The structures stood empty. Why? Climate change is the most popular explanation. If the wet period ended and the desert returned in full force, the irrigation systems might not have been enough. The trade routes could have shifted. Resources dried up, literally. But some archaeologists aren't convinced. If the environment became unlivable, why are there no signs of struggle? No mass graves, No evidence of famine or disease, just absence. Another theory suggests a cultural or political shift. Perhaps the power center moved. Perhaps new trade hubs emerged elsewhere, and Hili simply became irrelevant. Or perhaps, and this is the theory that keeps some researchers awake, they knew something was coming. A slow collapse they couldn't stop, and they left before it consumed them. Today, Hili is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The tombs have been partially restored. You can walk among them, touch the stones, see the carvings up close. But standing there, in the middle of that vast empty desert, one question lingers. If a civilization this advanced could disappear so completely, what else are we missing? At 7,000 feet, on a remote peak in southeastern Turkey, something impossible waits in the snow. Giant stone heads, 30 feet tall, scattered across the summit like pieces of a forgotten game. They stare out over the valleys below. Greek gods, Persian kings, and one man who declared himself equal to them all. This is Nemrut Dağ, and it makes no sense. The heads belong to statues that once sat on massive thrones, arranged in precise rows on the eastern and western terraces of the mountain. Between them, a pyramid of crushed rock rises 150 feet into the air, an artificial peak built on top of a natural one. Inside that pyramid, archaeologists believe, lies a tomb. They've never found it. The man who built this was Antiochus I Theos, king of Commagene, a small Hellenistic kingdom squeezed between the Roman and Parthian empires around 60 BCE. His kingdom lasted barely a century. His monument has lasted 2,000 years. But why here? Why this mountain? Commagene was a buffer state, a political compromise. Antiochus ruled over a culture that blended Greek, Persian, and Armenian influences. His kingdom was multicultural by necessity. Survival meant balancing East and West, Rome and Persia, without offending either. So he built a sanctuary, a place where gods from both worlds could coexist. On the terraces, you'll find Zeus and Apollo seated beside Persian deities like Ahura Mazda. Lions and eagles flank the thrones, symbols of power in both traditions. And in the center of it all, Antiochus himself, seated among the gods as an equal. It was a bold claim. Some would call it megalomaniacal. But here's what doesn't add up: the engineering. The summit of Nemrut Dağ is brutal. Winds howl across the ridge 9 months of the year. Snow buries the site from November to May. Temperatures drop below zero. There's no natural water source, no nearby quarries. Yet Antiochus somehow transported limestone blocks, weighing several tons up a 7,000-foot mountain, carved them into statues twice the height of a man, and assembled them into a complex that includes 2 terraces, a pyramid, and a network of processional paths. The pyramid alone contains an estimated 150,000 cubic meters of fist-sized stones, hand-placed and compacted. It's not a natural formation. Every rock was carried up that mountain and positioned deliberately. Why go to such lengths? The most common explanation is religious. Antiochus believed himself descended from both Alexander the Great and the Persian king Darius. His bloodline, he claimed, united 2 worlds. Nemrut Dağ was meant to be a hierothesion, a sacred burial ground and temple where he could be worshipped alongside the gods. Inscriptions on the site describe elaborate festivals held here. Twice a month, priests would climb the mountain to perform rituals in Antiochus's honor. His birthday, his coronation day, days when the king and the gods were celebrated together. But if this was purely about ego, why place it somewhere so inaccessible? Some researchers suggest the location itself held significance. The summit of Nemrut may have been considered a sacred space long before Antiochus arrived. Local legends speak of ancient rituals performed on high peaks, places where earth met sky, where mortals could communicate with the divine. Perhaps Antiochus wasn't inventing a tradition. Perhaps he was continuing one. Another theory focuses on visibility. On clear days, the monument can be seen from miles away. It's a landmark, a statement of power, visible across the valleys and trade routes below. For a small kingdom trying to assert itself between empires, that kind of presence mattered. But that still doesn't explain the tomb. Ground-penetrating radar has been used. Core samples have been taken. Archaeological teams have spent decades searching for an entrance. The pyramid remains sealed. If Antiochus is buried inside, his tomb has never been disturbed. No looters ever found it. No earthquakes exposed it. After 2,000 years, it's still intact, or it was never there to begin with. Some archaeologists now believe the tomb might not be inside the pyramid at all. It could be beneath the terraces, carved into the bedrock of the mountain itself. The pyramid could be a decoy, a monumental distraction, or it could be exactly what it appears, an enormous grave marker, with the body sealed somewhere no one will ever reach. What we do know is this: the statues weren't destroyed. They fell. Earthquakes toppled them over centuries. The heads rolled down the slopes and came to rest where they sit now, staring out over a kingdom that no longer exists. Antiochus's empire collapsed shortly after his death. Commagene was absorbed by Rome. The festivals stopped. The priests stopped climbing. And Nemrut Dağ was forgotten. It wasn't rediscovered until 1881, when a German engineer surveying the region stumbled upon the heads. Even then, it took decades before serious excavation began. Today, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tourists make the pre-dawn climb to watch the sunrise from the summit. The heads glow orange in the early light, and for a moment, you can almost imagine what Antiochus saw. A kingdom balanced between worlds, immortalized in stone. But the question remains: what drives a man to build something so massive, so remote, so impossible, knowing he'll never see it completed? And what's still hidden inside that mountain? There's a tower in the West Bank that predates everything, older than the pyramids by 4,000 years, older than Stonehenge by 6,000, older than farming as we understand it. It stands inside the ancient city of Jericho, or what's left of it. A stone cylinder, 30 feet tall, 8 feet wide at the base, with an internal staircase of 22 steps spiraling up through solid rock. It was built around 8,300 BCE. That date alone should stop you cold. In 8,300 BCE, humans were barely settling down. Agriculture was just beginning. Pottery didn't exist yet. Writing wouldn't be invented for another 5,000 years. Cities weren't even a concept. Yet someone built this. The tower was discovered in the 1950s by British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon during excavations at Tel es Sultan, the archaeological mound that contains the ruins of ancient Jericho. She found it buried beneath layers of later settlements, perfectly preserved by the dry desert climate. And immediately, the questions started. Why would a pre-agricultural society build a stone tower? What purpose could it serve? And how did they have the organization, the labor, and the knowledge to to construct something this complex. The tower isn't crude, it's engineered. The stones are shaped and fitted. The staircase inside is narrow but functional, carved with precision. Whoever built this understood weight distribution, structural stability, and planning. But they didn't have metal tools. They didn't have wheels. They didn't even have domesticated animals yet. So how? The most immediate theory was defense. Jericho sits in the Jordan Valley, near fresh water springs that made it one of the most attractive locations in the ancient world. The tower could have been part of a fortification system, a watchtower to spot approaching enemies, and there is a wall, a massive stone wall over 12 feet high, running around the settlement. The tower is built directly against it. But here's the problem with the defense theory. There's no evidence of warfare, no weapons caches, no burned layers, no skeletons showing signs of violence. If this was a military installation, where's the military? Some archaeologists argue that the wall wasn't for defense at all. It was for flood control. Jericho sits at the lowest point on Earth, below sea level, in a region prone to flash flooding. The wall could have been built to redirect water away from the settlement. If that's true, the tower might have been an observation point, not for enemies, but for water, a way to monitor seasonal floods and warn the community. But that raises another question. Why build something so elaborate just to watch for rain? In 2011, researchers from Tel Aviv University proposed a completely different explanation. They analyzed the alignment of the tower and discovered something strange. On the summer solstice, the setting sun casts the shadow of a nearby mountain directly onto the tower. Not close, not approximately, directly. It's too precise to be coincidence. The researchers argue that the tower was astronomical, a calendar marker, a way to track the longest day of the year, which would have been critical for an early agricultural society trying to predict planting seasons. But again, the timing is off. The people who built the tower weren't fully agricultural yet. They were transitioning, still hunting and gathering, but beginning to cultivate wild grains. Would they really invest that much labor into tracking the solstice before they'd fully committed to farming? Some researchers think yes. The tower wasn't just functional, it was symbolic, a declaration that this community was here to stay, that they were organizing, planning, thinking long-term. It was a monument to permanence. Others suggest the tower had a ritual purpose. Perhaps it was a platform for ceremonies, a place where leaders or shamrites could address the community from above. Height has always carried symbolic weight, closer to the sky, closer to the divine. The internal staircase supports this. You don't need stairs inside a watchtower. You need stairs if people are meant to climb it, to reach the top, to perform some act that requires ascent. But we'll never know for certain, because the people who built it left no written records, no carvings, no inscriptions, just the tower itself. What we do know is that Jericho was occupied continuously for thousands of years after the tower was built. Layer upon layer of settlement rose above it, burying it deeper with each generation. The tower became a foundation, literally and figuratively, for everything that came after. By the time the city we think of as biblical Jericho existed, the one Joshua supposedly conquered, the tower was already 7,000 years old, ancient even to the ancients. And then Jericho was abandoned. Invasions, earthquakes, shifts in trade routes, The city that had survived longer than almost any other finally fell silent. The tower remained. Modern Jericho sits nearby, a bustling Palestinian city unaware that beneath its streets lies one of humanity's first experiments in monumental architecture. Tourists can visit the excavation site. You can see the tower, walk around its base, peer into the narrow staircase that spirals up through stone. But standing there, in the heat and dust, surrounded by ruins that predate recorded history, one thought becomes unavoidable. If people 10,000 years ago could organize labor, plan construction, and build something this sophisticated, what else were they capable of? And how much of that knowledge did we lose before anyone thought to write it down? Off the southern coast of Sweden, on the island of Öland, there's a stone ring that's been abandoned 3 times. Each time, it was rebuilt. Each time, it was redesigned. And each time, the people who lived there left behind more questions than answers. This is Ekkatorp Fortress, and it's not like anything else in Scandinavia. The first version was built around 400 CE, late Iron Age. A circular stone wall, roughly 200 feet in diameter, enclosing a cluster of wooden buildings. No gates, no proper entrances, just narrow openings barely wide enough for a single person. It wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed for survival. But here's what makes Ekkatorp strange. Its location. Öland is flat, wind-battered, exposed. There are no natural defenses, no mountains to hide behind, no forests to retreat into. The island is a limestone plateau rising just above the Baltic Sea, visible for miles in every direction. If you wanted to build a fortress, you'd pick almost anywhere else. Yet someone chose this spot. And over the next 700 years, Ekkatorp was occupied, abandoned, rebuilt, and occupied again. 3 distinct phases, each leaving its own archaeological signature. The question is why? The most obvious answer is defense. The Baltic was dangerous in the Iron Age. Raiders moved along the coast, targeting settlements, stealing livestock, taking slaves. A fortified structure made sense, but Ekkatorp's design doesn't match typical defensive architecture. The walls are thick, nearly 20 feet in places, but they're low, too low to provide much protection from attackers. And those narrow entrances, they'd create bottlenecks, sure, but they'd also trap defenders inside if the fortress was breached. Some archaeologists suggest it wasn't built to withstand a siege. It was built to protect livestock. Öland's economy in the Iron Age was pastoral. Sheep, cattle, goats. During raids or harsh winters, villagers could drive their animals inside the fortress walls, keeping them safe while they waited out the danger. That would explain the layout. The buildings inside weren't houses. They were animal pens and storage areas. The narrow entrances would control the flow of livestock in and out, but that theory has problems too. Excavations have uncovered far more than animal bones. There's evidence of metalworking, jewelry production, weaving. These weren't just farmers hiding out during emergencies. They were craftspeople, producing goods that required time, skill, and stability. And then there's the trade material. Glass beads from the Roman Empire, amber from the Baltics, iron tools that show signs of advanced smithing techniques. Whoever lived at Ekkatorp wasn't isolated. They were connected to trade networks spanning thousands of miles. That doesn't fit the image of a desperate farming community huddling behind stone walls. So what was Ekkatorp really for? In the second phase, around 500 to 650 CE, the fortress was completely redesigned. The walls were heightened, proper gateways were added. The interior was divided into organized sectors with distinct areas for housing, storage, and workshops. This wasn't a livestock shelter anymore. This was a planned community, and it was built during the migration period, one of the most chaotic eras in European history. Tribes were moving, empires were collapsing. The Western Roman Empire had just fallen. Climate change was triggering crop failures across the continent. Ekatorp, in this context, starts to make more sense. It wasn't just a fortress, it was a refuge, a place where people could maintain some semblance of order while the world outside unraveled. But then, around 650 CE, it was abandoned again, completely, for nearly 300 years. No one knows why. There's no evidence of violence, no burned layers, no mass graves. The people just left, and the fortress stood empty while grass grew over the stones and wooden buildings rotted away. Then, around 950 CE, someone came back. The third phase of Ekatorp is the strangest. The walls were rebuilt, higher, thicker, more defensive than ever. But the interior was different. The organized sectors were gone. Buildings were crowded together with no clear plan. It felt improvised, desperate. This version of Ekatorp didn't last long. By 1300 CE, it was abandoned for the final time. What changed? Some researchers point to the rise of centralized kingdoms. By the High Medieval period, Scandinavia was consolidating. Local chieftains and independent fortresses were being absorbed into larger political structures. Royal power was expanding. Fortresses like Ekatorp became obsolete. Others suggest environmental factors. Uland's thin soil was always marginal for farming. Overuse could have depleted it. Climate shifts could have made the island even less hospitable. Or maybe the trade routes shifted. If Ekatorp's value was tied to its position along coastal networks, changes in those networks could have made the site irrelevant overnight. Whatever the reason, Ekatorp was left to crumble. It wasn't rediscovered until the 1960s, when Swedish archaeologists began systematic excavations. What they found astonished them. The preservation was extraordinary. Stone walls still standing, post holes marking the locations of wooden structures. Artifacts scattered across the site like a frozen moment in time. Today, part of the fortress has been reconstructed. You can walk through it, see the buildings as they might have looked, touch the stones that people stacked 1,600 years ago, but the central question remains unanswered. Why did people keep coming back to this place? What made Ekatorp worth rebuilding again and again on an exposed island with no natural advantages? And what finally convinced them to stop? In the small town of Saumur, in France's Loire Valley, there's a stone structure so large it was once mistaken for a Roman ruin. It's not Roman, it's far older. The Dolmen de Bagneux is one of the largest megalithic monuments in Europe. 75 feet long, 20 feet wide, covered by capstones, massive slabs of rock weighing up to 86 tons each, that rest on upright pillars like a giant's table. It was built around 4,500 years ago, and no one knows how. The word dolmen comes from Breton, a Celtic language still spoken in parts of France. Dol means table. Men means stone. Table of stone. Simple enough. But there's nothing simple about what it took to build one. The capstones alone present an impossible problem. 86 tons is the weight of a loaded semi-truck. Modern cranes can lift that. Modern engineering can move it. But Neolithic people didn't have cranes. They didn't have wheels, pulleys, or metal tools strong enough to shape stone at this scale. Yet they lifted these slabs, positioned them on top of upright stones, and balanced them with enough precision that they've remained standing for millennia. How? Theories range from the plausible to the wildly speculative. The most accepted explanation involves ramps, earthen ramps, built up gradually around the structure, allowing workers to roll the stones on logs inch by inch until they reach the height needed to slide the capstone into place. Once the stone was positioned, the ramps would be removed, leaving the dolmen standing free. It's labor-intensive, it's slow, but it works, at least in theory. The problem is, there's no evidence of ramps at Dún Aengus, no remnants, no compacted soil layers, no telltale marks in the landscape. If ramps were used, they vanished without a trace. Another theory suggests levers and counterweights, wooden beams used to lift one side of the stone, while workers place supports underneath, raising it incrementally. Eventually, the stone reaches the required height and can be maneuvered into position. Again, it's possible, but it requires extraordinary coordination. Dozens, maybe hundreds of people working in perfect sync, applying force at precisely the right moments. One mistake, one miscalculation, and tons of rock come crashing down. Would a Neolithic society risk that? Some researchers argue yes, because dolmens weren't just practical structures, they were sacred. These were tombs, places where the dead were laid to rest, where ancestors were honored, where communities gathered to maintain connections with those who came before. That kind of cultural importance justifies enormous effort. Excavations inside Dolmen de Dún Aengus have uncovered human remains. Not many, most were likely removed or decayed over the centuries, but enough to confirm this was a burial site, a communal tomb, used over generations, where bodies were placed and rituals performed. But that raises another question. Why so big? Most dolmens are modest. A few stones, a single capstone. Enough to mark a grave and protect it from the elements. Dolmen de Dún Aengus is monumental. It's not just protecting the dead, it's announcing them. Perhaps that was the point. Neolithic societies were transitioning from nomadic lifestyles to settled agriculture. Land was becoming important. Territory mattered. A monument like Dún Aengus could serve as a marker, a way of saying, this land is ours. Our ancestors are buried here. We belong. It's a claim written in stone. But if that's true, it suggests a level of social organization that challenges our assumptions about Neolithic people. Building something this large requires planning, leadership, resource management, a system for feeding and housing workers during construction. In other words, it requires complexity, and that's what makes dolmens so unsettling. We tend to think of prehistoric societies as primitive, small bands of people scraping by, barely surviving. But structures like Dún Aengus suggest otherwise. They suggest coordination, hierarchy, long-term thinking. They suggest civilization. One of the strangest aspects of Dolmen de Dún Aengus is its survival. It's been standing in the middle of a populated area for 4,500 years. Through wars, invasions, urban expansion, agricultural development, it's still there. Luck played a role, but so did reverence. Local legends persisted for centuries about the stones, stories of giants, of ancient kings, of sacred ground that shouldn't be disturbed. Whether people believe those stories or not, they left the dolmen alone. In the 19th century, it was nearly destroyed. The landowner wanted to clear the site for construction. But public outcry stopped him. Scholars intervened. The dolmen was declared a historical monument in 1862, one of the first such protections in France. Today, it sits in someone's backyard. Literally. You can visit, but you have to pass through a garden, walk past flower beds, and there it is, a massive Neolithic tomb surrounded by hedges and modern houses. It's jarring. This thing that predates written language standing next to a suburban home. But in a way, that's fitting, because dolmens were never meant to be isolated. They were part of the landscape, part of daily life. Communities lived around them, farmed near them, used them as gathering places. They were monuments, yes, but they were also reminders of where people came from, of what they were capable of the permanence they could create, even without metal, without machines, without anything but stone and will. Still, the question lingers. How did they know? How did Neolithic people understand engineering well enough to balance 86 tons of rock on pillars and have it stay balanced for 4,500 years? What knowledge did they possess that we've spent centuries trying to rediscover? In western France, near the town of Bougon, there's a cemetery that predates Egypt, not by centuries, by millennia. The tumulus of Bougon is a complex of 5 burial mounds, artificial hills constructed from earth and stone that date back as far as 4,700 BCE. That's nearly 7,000 years ago, before the pharaohs, before the first ziggurats, before metal tools, and it wasn't built all at once. It was expanded, modified, and used continuously for over 2,000 years. That kind of continuity is almost unheard of. The largest mound, Tumulus A, is roughly 230 feet long and 16 feet high. It covers 2 internal chambers built from massive limestone slabs arranged in a passage grave design. You enter through a narrow corridor that opens into a central room where the dead were placed. Inside, archaeologists found the remains of over 200 individuals, not scattered, not random, organized by family groups, arranged carefully with grave goods placed beside them, pottery, stone tools, jewelry made from shells and bone. These weren't disposable burials. They were deliberate, respectful. The people of Bougon cared deeply about their dead. But here's what makes this place extraordinary: the continuity. Most Neolithic sites were used for a generation or two, then abandoned. People moved, resources shifted, new settlements replaced old ones. But Bougon was different. For 2,000 years, longer than the entire history of Christianity, people kept coming back. Why? The most straightforward explanation is ancestral reverence. Bougon was sacred ground, a place where the bones of the ancestors rested and where the living returned generation after generation to honor them. In Neolithic societies, ancestors weren't just remembered, they were powerful. They connected the present to the past. They legitimized claims to land, to resources, to leadership. Maintaining those connections was essential. A necropolis like Bougon would serve that purpose perfectly. But there's more going on here than simple ancestor worship. The mounds aren't identical. Each one is different. Different size, different internal structure, different construction techniques. Tumulus A is the oldest and largest. Tumulus B is smaller, with a single chamber. Tumulus C has multiple chambers connected by passages. It's as if each mound represents a different phase of development, a different generation's interpretation of how the dead should be honored. That suggests evolution, learning, experimentation. The people who built Tumulus A in 4700 BCE didn't have a blueprint. They were inventing this, and their descendants, centuries later, looked at what had been built and thought, "We can do this differently. We can improve it." That's remarkable. It means they were thinking critically about tradition, honoring it, yes, but not blindly following it. One of the most puzzling aspects of Bougon is the sheer scale of labor involved. The mounds are massive. Thousands of tons of earth had to be moved. Limestone slabs, some weighing several tons, had to be quarried, transported, and positioned. The chambers inside had to be built to support the weight of all that earth pressing down from above. And all of this was done without metal tools, without draft animals, without wheels. The standard explanation involves large groups of people working together over extended periods. Entire communities contributing labor, possibly during specific seasons when agricultural work slowed down. But that assumes a level of organization that's hard to reconcile with what we think we know about Neolithic life. These weren't cities. There's no evidence of large, permanent settlements near Bougon. The people were likely semi-nomadic, moving with the seasons, following game and wild plant resources. Yet somehow, they coordinated labor on a scale that required planning, leadership, and resource allocation. How did that work? Who decided when construction happened? Who organized the workers? Who fed them? We don't know. What we do know is that the people of Bougon weren't isolated. Pottery found inside the mounds shows similarities to styles from hundreds of miles away. Stone tools were made from materials not locally available, meaning trade networks existed. There's even evidence of cultural exchange. The passage grave design used at Bougon appears in other Neolithic sites across Western Europe, from Brittany to Ireland to Scandinavia. Some researchers suggest a shared belief system, a common religion or ideology that spread along trade routes, carrying with it architectural ideas and burial practices. Others argue it's simpler than that. People traveled. They saw what others had built. They brought those ideas home. Either way, it challenges the notion of Neolithic people as isolated and primitive. By the end of the Neolithic period, around 2700 BCE, Bougon was abandoned. The mounds were sealed. Grass grew over them. Trees took root. For thousands of years, they were just hills in the landscape. Local farmers knew they were artificial. You can't miss the scale, the shape, the obvious signs of human construction. But the original purpose was forgotten. Legends grew. Some said giants built them, others said ancient kings were buried inside. It wasn't until the 1840s that serious archaeological investigation began. What they found stunned them. The chambers were intact. The bones were still there. The grave goods had survived. It was a time capsule, a snapshot of life and death in the Neolithic, preserved under tons of earth for nearly 7,000 years. Today, Bougon is a museum and archaeological park. You can walk among the mounds, enter the chambers, see the stones that people placed so carefully all those millennia ago. But standing inside one of those dark, cool chambers surrounded by stone, you can't help but feel the weight of time. These people had no writing, no cities, no metal, yet they built something that outlasted empires. What drove them? What did they believe? And what would they think if they knew we were still asking questions about them 7,000 years later? On a tiny, windswept island off the coast of Scotland, there's a stone tower that's never fallen, Not once, in 2,000 years, no mortar holds it together, no cement binds the stones, yet it stands 43 feet tall, perfectly intact, weathering storms that have leveled modern buildings. This is the Broch of Musa, and it's the best preserved example of a structure type that exists nowhere else on Earth. Brochs are unique to Scotland. More than 500 have been identified, scattered across the northern mainland and the islands. Most are ruins, collapsed walls, crumbled foundations, barely recognizable piles of stone. But Musa is different. Musa is complete. Its walls rise in a perfect curve, tapering slightly toward the top. The outer diameter at the base is 50 feet. The walls themselves are 13 feet thick at ground level, thinning to about 6 feet at the summit. Inside, there's a central courtyard open to the sky. A staircase spirals upward between the inner and outer wall layers, a hidden passage that climbs all the way to the top. You can walk it today, climb the stairs, stand on the parapet, look out over the North Sea, just as someone did 2,000 years ago. But why they built it remains a mystery. The most common theory is defense. Brochs appeared during the Iron Age, a period of tribal conflict and raiding. A structure like Musa, tall, thick-walled, with a single narrow entrance, would be nearly impossible to breach. Attackers couldn't scale the walls. They couldn't burn stone. If defenders retreated inside and sealed the entrance, they could hold out indefinitely, provided they had food and water. That makes sense, except for one problem. Most brochs aren't in defensive locations. They're not on hilltops or cliff edges. They're not positioned to control strategic passes or overlook enemy territory. Musa sits on flat ground near the shoreline. It's visible from miles away. If you wanted to hide from raiders, this is the last place you'd build. So maybe defense wasn't the primary purpose. Another theory suggests status. Brochs were expensive to build, labor-intensive, resource-heavy projects that required skilled masons and community cooperation. Constructing one was a statement of wealth and power. In that context, Musa becomes a monument, a way for a local chieftain to demonstrate control over resources and people. The broch itself becomes secondary to what it represents: authority. But that doesn't explain the design. Brochs aren't just tall, they're engineered. The double-wall construction, 2 layers of stone with a gap in between, creates structural stability while reducing weight. The staircase inside that gap serves as both access and reinforcement, distributing stress throughout the structure. This isn't primitive construction. This is sophisticated architecture, and it's consistent. Brochs from opposite ends of Scotland share the same basic design: circular plan, double walls, internal staircase, tapering profile. That suggests a shared building tradition, passed down and refined over generations. But where did it come from? There are no earlier prototypes. Brochs appear suddenly in the archaeological record around 100 BCE, fully formed. No experimental phases, no simpler versions that gradually evolved into the final design. It's as if someone invented the concept and then spread it across northern Scotland in a remarkably short period. That's unusual. Most architectural styles develop gradually, borrowing and adapting from neighboring cultures. But brochs have no obvious predecessors. They're distinctly Scottish. Some researchers suggest external influence, perhaps from Mediterranean cultures with whom the Scots traded. Roman accounts mention trade with northern tribes. Goods moved, ideas moved. Maybe architectural concepts moved too. But if blocks were inspired by Mediterranean towers, why don't they look more similar? Roman fortifications are rectangular, with flat walls and clear military design. Blocks are curved, organic, almost sculptural. The differences are as striking as any similarities. Another possibility is that blocks served multiple purposes. Defense, yes. Status, certainly. But also storage, shelter for livestock during harsh winters, communal gathering spaces during festivals or tribal councils. A structure this substantial wouldn't have been built for just one use. Excavations at Musa have uncovered evidence of habitation. Hearths, pottery, animal bones. People lived here, or at least spent extended periods inside. The central courtyard would have been open to smoke from cooking fires, which means either they tolerated the smoke or they had some way of venting it we can't identify. Life inside a broch wouldn't have been comfortable. The walls, while impressive, would create a damp, cold interior. Natural light would be minimal. Wind would howl through the entrance and swirl around the courtyard. But it would be safe, protected, secure. Perhaps that was enough. One of the strangest aspects of Musa is its appearance in Viking sagas. Around 900 CE, centuries after the broch was built, Norse settlers arrived in the islands, and they mentioned Musa by name. In the Orkneyinga saga, a story describes two lovers fleeing to Musa and taking refuge inside a stone fortress. The saga treats it as ancient even then, a relic from a forgotten age. By the time the Vikings arrived, the people who built Musa were long gone. Their culture had vanished. Their language was lost, but the broch remained, and the Vikings used it, sheltered in it, recognized its strength. Today, Musa is a scheduled ancient monument. It's protected, studied, visited by archaeologists and tourists who make the ferry crossing to the island just to see it. But after 2,000 years, the central question remains unanswered. Why did the people of Iron Age Scotland build these towers? What threat were they facing? What need were they fulfilling? And what knowledge did they possess that allowed them to construct something so perfectly that it's outlasted everything else from their civilization? There stands a gateway made of coral limestone. Two massive pillars, each weighing somewhere around 40 tons, supporting a lintel stone across the top. The locals call it Harmonga a Maui, the gateway of Maui. And for centuries, no one could agree on why it was built. This is Tonga, a kingdom spread across more than 170 islands, most of them uninhabited. The Trilithon sits on the main island of Tongatapu, in a clearing that doesn't seem particularly special at first glance. No temple ruins nearby, no obvious astronomical alignment, just this enormous stone structure, standing alone in the tropical heat, about 13 feet tall and 19 feet wide. The thing is, when you get up close, you start to notice details that don't add up. The surfaces of the stones show chisel marks, precise cuts. These weren't natural formations shaped by wind and water. Someone quarried these blocks, transported them, and lifted that lintel into place. And we're talking about the 13th century here, maybe earlier. The oral traditions aren't entirely clear on the date. According to Tongan legend, the structure was built by Tuitatui, the 11th Tui Tonga. That's essentially a sacred king. The stories say he erected it as a monument to his two sons, or possibly as a gateway to the royal compound. But here's the problem with that explanation. The compound, if there ever was one, is gone. there's no archaeological evidence of buildings, walls, or ceremonial platforms in the immediate area. Just the trilithon, standing there, waiting. For a long time, that's all anyone had. Local legends and guesswork. Then in the 1967, King Taufa Ahau Tupu IV, who had a background in education and a deep interest in his nation's history, proposed something different. He suggested the Ha'amonga Maui wasn't a gateway at all. It was a calendar, an astronomical observatory. The king noticed markings on the lintel stone, notches cut into the coral at specific points. When he measured the angles, he found that notches aligned with the position of the sun at the solstices. Summer solstice on one side, winter solstice on the other. If you stood in the right spot at dawn on June 21st, the sun would rise directly over one of those marks. 6 months later, same thing on the opposite side. It was an elegant theory, and it made sense. The ancient Polynesians were master navigators. They crossed thousands of miles of open ocean using the stars, the swells, the flight patterns of birds. Why wouldn't they build monuments to track the sun's movement? The alignment seemed too precise to be coincidence, but not everyone bought it. Some archaeologists pointed out that the notches could have been added later, maybe even in the 20th century. Coral limestone is soft, relatively easy to carve. Without carbon dating or some kind of verifiable archaeological context, there was no way to prove when those marks were made. And even if they were original, did that really mean the whole structure was built as a solar calendar? Or were the notches just decorative? Then there's the transportation problem. The nearest quarry for this type of coral limestone is several miles away. Moving 40-ton blocks across that distance, even on log rollers, would have required hundreds of people, coordinated effort, engineering knowledge, and yet there's no evidence of ramps, no tool caches, no remains of the infrastructure you'd expect from such a massive construction project. The stones are just there. Some researchers have suggested the trilithon might have been a symbolic gateway to the afterlife, a threshold between the world of the living and the world of the ancestors. Polynesian cosmology places enormous importance on such boundaries. But again, that's speculation. There are no carvings, no inscriptions, nothing to indicate religious significance beyond the sheer scale of the thing. What makes Ha'amonga Maui so frustrating is how much we don't know. We can't even say for certain how old it is. Radiocarbon dating requires organic material, and there's none embedded in the stones. Oral histories place it somewhere in the 1200s, but oral histories also say it was built by a demigod named Maui, who lifted the stones into place with supernatural strength. So where does the myth end and the history begin? Stand in front of this structure on a quiet afternoon, and you can feel the weight of those questions. 2 pillars, 1 lintel, and a silence that stretches back 800 years. Was it a calendar, a gate, a monument to royal power? We still don't know. In the high desert of north-central Mexico, about 30 miles south of the city of Zacatecas, there's a ruin that doesn't fit the pattern. It's called La Quemada, the burned place. And when you see it for the first time, rising out of the scrubland on a hilltop, you understand why it has that name. The stones are blackened, scorched, like something terrible happened here. The site covers roughly 15 acres, terraced into the slope of a volcanic hill. Massive stone walls, some of them nearly 20 feet thick, pyramids, platforms, a network of causeways connecting different sections of the complex, and at the highest point, a fortified citadel with commanding views of the valley below. This wasn't a village. It was a fortress city, built to defend against something. The question is, what? La Quemada was occupied sometime between 500 and 900 AD, though the exact dates are still debated. That puts it roughly in the same period as Teotihuacan to the south and the early Maya cities to the east. But La Quemada doesn't look like either of those civilizations. The architecture is different, rougher, more utilitarian. The people who built this place weren't interested in decoration. They were interested in survival. Walk through the ruins today, and you'll see evidence of serious defensive planning. The walls aren't just tall, they're angled, designed to deflect attackers. There are narrow passageways that force people into single file, perfect for ambushes. Watchtowers positioned to see for miles in every direction, and the entire complex is laid out so that if one section fell, the defenders could retreat to higher ground and keep fighting. But defending against who? That's where the story gets murky. There are no written records from La Quemada, no glyphs, no codices, nothing. The people who lived here either didn't have a writing system, or if they did, none of it survived. So everything we know comes from the stones themselves and the artifacts left behind. And some of those artifacts are disturbing. Archaeologists have found evidence of human sacrifice, not on the scale of the Aztecs, who come centuries later, but enough to raise questions. There are tzompantli, skull racks, where the heads of enemies or captives were displayed. There are bones showing cut marks consistent with ritual dismemberment. And then there's the Hall of Columns, a massive structure at the heart of the site, where researchers found the remains of dozens of individuals, many of them children. The traditional interpretation was that La Quemada was a frontier outpost, a military stronghold protecting the more advanced civilizations to the south from northern barbarians. The nomadic tribes up north, the ones the later Aztecs would call Chichimecas, were known for raiding agricultural settlements. So maybe La Quemada was built as a buffer, a place to control trade routes and keep the raiders at bay. But newer research is challenging that idea. For one thing, La Quemada shows signs of significant population, maybe 2,000 people at its peak. That's not a garrison, that's a city. And the agricultural terraces surrounding the site suggest these people were growing their own food, not just defending someone else's territory. They were settled, organized, self-sufficient. Then there's the burning. The name La Quemada isn't just poetic. There's actual evidence of massive fires throughout the site, roof beams charred, adobe walls baked hard by intense heat, floors covered in ash. And here's the strange part. It all seems to have happened at once. Around 900 AD, the entire complex went up in flames, and after that, it was abandoned. No reoccupation, no rebuilding, just silence. Was it an attack? Did the northern raiders finally overwhelm the defenses, or was it something internal? A revolt, maybe? A religious purge? Some archaeologists have suggested the burning was intentional, a ritual destruction. The people of La Quemada deliberately torching their own city before walking away. But why would they do that? What could drive an entire population to destroy everything they'd built? There's another theory, quieter, less discussed in the academic literature. It suggests La Quemada wasn't defending against northern tribes at all. It was one of them. That the fortress was built by the so-called barbarians themselves, using techniques borrowed from the south, and that the human remains, the skull racks, the evidence of violence, weren't about defending civilization. They were about projecting power, fear. If that's true, then La Quemada becomes something darker, not a protective outpost, but a terror state, a place where power was maintained through brutality until one day it all came crashing down. The blackened stones don't say. They just sit there on that hilltop, holding their secrets close, watching the desert, waiting. Sardinia is an island that doesn't quite belong to anywhere. It sits in the middle of the Mediterranean, closer to North Africa than to Rome, speaking a language that isn't quite Italian, holding on to customs that predate the Roman Empire by more than 1,000 years. And scattered across this island are approximately 7,000 stone towers, massive beehive-shaped structures built without mortar. The locals call them nuraghi, and no one can agree on what they were for. Nuraghi Losa is one of the largest. It sits in the west-central part of the island, near the town of Abasanta, rising out of farmland that's been cultivated for millennia. From a distance, it looks almost natural, like a small hill. But get closer and you see the precision. Blocks of basalt stacked in corbelled layers, each ring slightly smaller than the one below, creating that distinctive beehive shape. The central tower stands about 40 feet tall, and it's surrounded by a defensive wall with 3 smaller towers at the corners. The whole complex covers roughly half an acre. The dating is tricky, but most archaeologists place the construction of Nuraghi Losa somewhere around 1500 BC. That's Bronze Age. That's before the Greeks started building the Parthenon, before King Solomon's temple. These stones were already ancient when Rome was founded. Step inside the main tower and you're hit by the coolness. Even on the hottest summer day, the interior stays relatively comfortable. The walls are several feet thick, and there are no windows in the lower chambers. Light comes from narrow slits higher up and from the central shaft that runs through the middle of the structure. There's a tholos chamber, a circular room with a domed ceiling and a stone stairway built into the wall that spirals upward to the upper levels. The craftsmanship is remarkable, each stone fitted so precisely that even after 3,500 years, the structure is still standing. But standing for what purpose? That's the question that's plagued researchers since the first serious archaeological work began in the 19th century. The most obvious answer is defense. The towers are fortified. They're positioned on high ground with clear sight lines. The entrances are small, easily defended. Many nuraghi, including Losa, have wells inside, which means they could withstand a siege. So clearly, someone was worried about attack. But if they're fortresses, why are there so many of them? 7,000 defensive towers on an island that's only about 140 miles long. That's one nuraghi for every 3 or 4 square miles. You could almost see from one to the next. That's not a defensive network. That's saturation. And it raises an uncomfortable question. Who were they defending against? Each other. Some researchers think the nuraghi weren't military at all. They suggest these were religious structures, temples, the circular chambers, the precise astronomical alignments that some towers seem to have. The artifacts found inside, votive offerings, small bronze figurines, suggest ritual use. Maybe the Nuragic people worshipped their ancestors in these towers. Maybe the height was symbolic, bringing them closer to the gods. Others argue they were status symbols, Bronze Age equivalents of castles, each local chieftain building his own nuraga to demonstrate wealth and power. The more elaborate the tower, the more important the family. That would explain the variation in size and complexity. Some nuragi are simple, single towers. Others, like Losa, are sprawling complexes with multiple structures and defensive walls. Then there's the practical theory. Maybe they were just homes, fortified dwellings for extended families or small communities. The interior chambers would have provided shelter. The upper levels could have been used for storage or as lookout points. The thick walls would have kept the inhabitants cool in summer and warm in winter. It's not glamorous, but it makes sense. The problem is, none of these theories fully explains the evidence. There are nuragi with clear defensive features that show no signs of battle damage. There are towers positioned in places with no strategic value whatsoever. There are structures with astronomical alignments that also have wells and storage rooms. It's like the Nuragic people built these things for multiple purposes, or their purposes changed over the centuries of use. And then there's the question of the collapse. The Nuragic civilization thrived for roughly 1,000 years, from about 1800 BC to 800 BC. During that time, they developed metalworking, built ships, traded with the Mycenaeans and the Phoenicians, created a distinct artistic style. And then, around the time the Phoenicians started establishing colonies on Sardinia, the Nuragi stopped being built. The civilization didn't disappear exactly, but it transformed. The towers fell into disuse. Some were repurposed. Others were simply abandoned. Why? Did the Phoenicians conquer them, assimilate them, or did the Nuragic people themselves decide these towers were no longer necessary? There's evidence of cultural blending. Phoenician pottery mixed with Nuragic bronze work. But there's no clear record of conflict, no mass graves, no destruction layers. Nuragi Losa sits there in its field, surrounded by olive trees and grazing sheep, and it doesn't offer answers. You can climb the ancient stairs. You can stand in the Tholos chamber where people stood 3,000 years ago. You can run your hand along the basalt blocks and feel the tool marks from Bronze Age chisels. But you can't know why they built it. Not really. The stones remember, but they're not talking. Cyprus sits at a crossroads, where Europe meets Asia, meets Africa, where trade routes converge and civilizations have clashed for thousands of years. But long before the Phoenicians, before the Greeks, before any of the empires we read about in school, there was a village on the southern slopes of the island, a settlement of round stone houses built by people who barely understood agriculture. They called it Khirokitia, or at least that's what we call it now. We don't know what they called it. They left no writing, no symbols we can interpret, just stones and bones and questions. The site was discovered in 1934, but serious excavation didn't begin until after World War II. What they found was staggering. A village dating back to 7,000 BC. That's 9,000 years ago. Neolithic. Pre-pottery Neolithic, actually. Which means these people were still making vessels out of stone because they hadn't figured out ceramics yet. They were at the very beginning of settled life, and they were already building architecture that would last millennia. The houses at Khirokitia are unlike anything else from that period. They're circular, anywhere from 6 to 30 feet in diameter, made from limestone and mud brick. The walls are thick, built to last. The floors are plastered. And here's the unusual part. Many of these houses have interior platforms, raised sections along the walls where people would have slept or worked. Some of the larger structures have 2 levels, connected by stone staircases. These weren't crude huts. These were engineered dwellings. But the layout of the village is what really catches your attention. The houses aren't scattered randomly. They're arranged along a main street that runs up the hillside, with smaller alleyways branching off. There's planning here, organization. The entire settlement is surrounded by a massive defensive wall, in places nearly 10 feet thick. So these people, these early farmers who were just figuring out how to domesticate plants, already understood the need for fortification. Against what, though? That's the mystery. There's no evidence of warfare at Khirokitia. No mass graves filled with bodies showing signs of violence. No weapons beyond basic hunting tools. The wall is there, impressive and undeniable, but nothing suggests it was ever put to the test. Maybe the threat was psychological. Maybe just having the wall was enough to deter whoever they were afraid of. Or maybe they weren't afraid of people at all. Cyprus has wild animals, boar, deer. In ancient times, there may have been other predators. The wall could have been about keeping wildlife out, not enemies. Walk through the reconstructed houses today, and you get a sense of how these people lived. Small hearths in the center of each dwelling, stone tools for grinding grain, obsidian blades imported from Anatolia, which tells us they were trading across the sea. And then there are the burials. This is where Khirokitia gets genuinely strange. The dead were buried under the floors of the houses, right beneath where the living walked and slept. Adults, children, sometimes multiple individuals in a single grave. The bodies were placed in a fetal position, tightly flexed and often covered with ochre. Some had stones placed on their chests or heads, heavy stones as if to keep them down. Now, ancestor worship isn't unusual in Neolithic cultures. Many societies honored their dead by keeping them close. But at Khirokitia, there's something more deliberate about it. The placement of those stones suggests more than reverence. It suggests fear, like maybe they believed the dead could come back if not properly restrained. There's also evidence of skull removal. In some graves, the skulls are missing, carefully removed post-mortem, probably after the flesh had decomposed. Were they kept as relics? Worshipped? Destroyed? We don't know. The skulls are gone, taken somewhere else, or perhaps ground down and scattered. The practice appears in other Neolithic sites across the Near East, but each culture seems to have had its own reasons. The population at Khirokitia probably never exceeded a few hundred people, maybe 300 at its peak. They grew wheat and barley. They raised pigs and goats. They made beads from carnelian, which means they had contact with the mainland because carnelian doesn't occur naturally on Cyprus. They lived in this village for about 1,000 years, maintaining the same architectural style, the same burial practices, the same daily rhythms. And then, around 6,000 BC, they left. The entire site was abandoned, not burned, not destroyed, just vacated. There's a gap in the archaeological record after that. For roughly 1,500 years, there's almost no evidence of human habitation on Cyprus. It's as if the island emptied out. What happened? Climate change is one theory. maybe a drought made farming impossible. But you'd expect to see evidence of desperation, thinner livestock bones, changes in diet. There's none of that. Disease is another possibility. A plague that wiped out most of the population and scared off the survivors. But again, no mass graves, no sudden die-off visible in the burial record. Some archaeologists think it was cultural, that the people of Khirokitia simply decided to move on. Return to the mainland maybe, rejoin the larger Neolithic communities in Anatolia or the Levant. But that doesn't explain the gap. If people left Cyprus, why didn't others immediately take their place? An island with arable land and fresh water doesn't stay empty by accident. Khirokitia sits on that hillside, partially reconstructed, and it doesn't give up its secrets easily. The round houses stand where they've always stood. The defensive wall still marks the perimeter. But the people who built them? They're ghosts. On the western edge of Ireland, on an island so windswept and barren it feels like the end of the world, there's a stone fort perched on a cliff, 300 feet of sheer rock face dropping straight down into the Atlantic. The fort is called Dún Aengus in Irish, Dún Aengus in English, and it's one of the most dramatic archaeological sites in Europe. Also, one of the most baffling. The island is Inishmore, the largest of the Aran Islands, rocky, treeless. The soil is so thin you can see limestone underneath. For centuries, the people here built walls from the endless supply of stones, creating a patchwork of tiny fields barely big enough to grow potatoes. It's a hard place to live, always has been, which makes you wonder why anyone would invest the massive labor required to build a fortress here. Dún Aengus isn't small. The outer wall encloses nearly 30 acres. There are 4 concentric rings of defensive walls, each one progressively smaller as you move toward the center. The innermost enclosure sits right at the cliff edge, a semicircular wall of dry stone construction. No mortar, just precisely fitted limestone blocks. Some of those blocks weigh several tons. The wall itself is 18 feet thick in places and originally stood about 20 feet high. But here's what makes Dún Aengus truly strange. Between the middle and outer walls, there's a band of stone pillars, thousands of them, jagged limestone stakes driven into the ground at angles, creating a field of obstacles that would be nearly impossible to cross. The Irish call them chevaux de frise, borrowing the French military term. They're designed to stop a charging enemy, break up cavalry, slow down infantry, make any assault a nightmare. Except there were no horses on Inishmore in the Bronze Age, and the fort is on a cliff. You can't attack from the ocean side. So who were they defending against that required this level of fortification? The dating of Dún Aengus has been controversial. For a long time, people assumed it was Iron Age, maybe 500 BC or so. But radiocarbon dating of materials from the site pushes the construction back further. Parts of the fort may date to 1100 BC or earlier. That's late Bronze Age. That's when the Mycenaean civilization in Greece was collapsing, when the Sea Peoples were terrorizing the Mediterranean, when the whole Bronze Age world was falling apart. Was Ireland affected by that collapse? We don't have written records from the period, so it's hard to say, but there's archaeological evidence of stress. Hill forts appearing across Ireland and Britain, weapon hoards buried in bogs, signs that people were nervous, preparing for something. Maybe Dún Aengus was part of that preparation, a refuge for the people of Inishmore when raiders came, and raiders did come to Ireland. We know that from scattered references in later texts and from the physical evidence of burned settlements along the coast. Vikings mostly, but they came much later. In the Bronze Age, the threats would have been different. Rival tribes, pirates, groups displaced by warfare or famine elsewhere, looking for new territory. Stand inside the innermost enclosure today, and you can feel the exposure. The wind comes off the Atlantic with nothing to stop it. On stormy days, the spray from the waves below reaches the top of the cliff. There's no shelter, no buildings remain, though there are the outlines of stone huts visible in the grass. These would have been simple structures, thatched roofs probably, earth floors, just enough to keep the rain off. The view is extraordinary. On a clear day, you can see the cliffs of Moher to the south, the mountains of Connemara to the north. Anyone approaching the island would be visible for miles. That's the point of building on high ground. Early warning, time to prepare. But the cliff bothers some archaeologists. Why build right at the edge? The defensive walls would have been just as effective 100 yards inland, and you wouldn't risk erosion undermining your foundations. Because erosion is happening. The cliff is retreating, slowly but measurably. Parts of the fort that existed 1,000 years ago are gone now, tumbled into the sea. Eventually, the whole thing will collapse. Unless the cliff was the point. Maybe Dún Aengus wasn't just defensive. Maybe it was ceremonial. The edge between land and sea, life and death. The Celts, who came later and inherited many of these ancient sites, considered liminal spaces sacred. Thresholds, boundaries, the shore at dawn, the forest at dusk, the cliff where earth meets ocean. There's evidence of ritual activity at Dún Aengus. Not much, but enough to make you think. A deliberately placed stone with cup marks. Fragments of pottery that suggest feasting. Nothing conclusive, but suggestive. Maybe the fort served multiple purposes. Defense when needed, ceremony when not. Local legends say the fort was built by the Firbolg, a mythical race who inhabited Ireland before the Celts arrived. The stories describe them as refugees from Greece, fleeing slavery, settling on these barren islands because no one else wanted them. It's mythology, not history. But like most myths, it might contain a grain of truth. Maybe the people who built Dún Aengus were outsiders, displaced, building on the edge of the world because they had nowhere else to go. The stones don't say, they just stand there, battered by wind and spray, slowly crumbling, holding that cliff, holding that view, holding secrets the Atlantic will eventually claim. In the arid hills of southeastern Spain, about 11 miles from the modern city of Almeria, there's a site that shouldn't exist, not in 3200 BC, not with that level of sophistication. It's called Los Millares, and when archaeologists first excavated it in the late 19th century, they couldn't believe what they were looking at. A fortified settlement with concentric walls, bastions, advanced metallurgy, and a necropolis containing dozens of elaborate tombs. This was Copper Age Europe. People were supposed to be living in simple farming villages, not building proto-cities with defensive architecture that wouldn't look out of place 1,000 years later. The site sits on a plateau between two rivers, the Andarax and the Rambla de Huechar, natural defensive position, steep slopes on three sides. But the people of Los Millares weren't satisfied with natural defenses. They built walls, multiple rings of them. The outer wall stretches nearly a mile around the perimeter, reinforced with at least 15 bastions, circular towers projecting from the wall at regular intervals. These aren't decorative. They're military engineering. Bastions allow defenders to create crossfire, covering every approach with overlapping fields of fire. Except these people didn't have bows that could shoot very far. They didn't have siege engines. So what kind of warfare were they preparing for that required this level of planning? The main settlement probably housed around 1,000 people at its peak, maybe 1,500. The houses were simple, circular stone foundations with mud brick walls and thatched roofs. There are remnants of streets, a basic layout, nothing extraordinary about the domestic architecture. But the fortifications tell a different story. Whoever designed these defenses understood tactics. They understood how to channel attackers into kill zones, how to create strong points that could hold even if the outer walls were breached. And it's not just the main settlement. Scattered across the hills surrounding Los Millares are at least 13 fortified outposts, smaller versions of the main fort, positioned on high ground, guarding the approaches. A defensive network. This is coordinated planning on a scale that shouldn't exist in Copper Age Iberia. But here's what really throws researchers. Los Millares was peaceful, or at least there's no evidence of warfare, no mass graves, no burned layers indicating the settlement was attacked and destroyed, no bodies with arrow wounds or crushed skulls. The fortifications are there, massive and undeniable, but they don't seem to have ever been used. So were they necessary, or were they symbolic? Some archaeologists argue that the walls were about prestige, not protection. That building elaborate fortifications was a way for the elite to demonstrate power and control labor. Look what we can make people build. Look how organized we are. The bastions and outposts weren't for defense, they were for display. Others aren't convinced. They point to the strategic positioning, the overlapping fields of fire, the careful integration of natural and artificial defenses. That's not for show. That's practical military architecture. Maybe Los Millares never came under sustained attack because the defenses worked. Because anyone considering a raid looked at those walls and decided to go somewhere easier. What's undisputed is the wealth. Los Millares was rich. The excavations have uncovered copper tools and weapons, including daggers and axe heads. The metallurgy is advanced for the period. They were smelting ore, casting metal, creating alloys. Copper sources exist in the nearby Sierra de Gardor, so they had access to raw materials. But more than that, they were trading. Ivory from North Africa, ostrich eggshells, amber from the Baltic. These people had connections across the Mediterranean and beyond. The necropolis sits just outside the walls. Over 80 collective tombs, called tholoi. These are circular stone chambers, covered by earthen mounds, some large enough to hold dozens of burials. The tombs have passageways, antechambers, sophisticated construction techniques, and the grave goods are remarkable. Carved stone idols, engraved pottery, personal ornaments, objects that suggest social hierarchy, specialized craftspeople, religious beliefs we can only guess at. One tomb in particular stands out, larger than the others, more elaborate. The passage is longer, the chamber more carefully constructed. Inside, archaeologists found the remains of over 100 individuals buried over centuries, along with ivory, copper, decorated ostrich eggs, ritual objects. This wasn't a tomb for commoners. This was where the elite, the rulers, the important families were laid to rest. So Los Millares had wealth, had organization, had contact with distant cultures. And yet, around 2200 BC, it was abandoned. The population declined gradually, then disappeared. The fortifications were left to crumble. The tombs were sealed and forgotten. Why? Climate change is the usual suspect. The region experienced a severe drought during that period. Rivers dried up. Crops failed. Maybe Los Milares, with its 1,000-plus inhabitants, simply couldn't sustain itself. The people dispersed, moving to areas with more reliable water sources. But that doesn't explain the fortifications. If the settlement declined due to environmental stress, you'd expect to see evidence of that stress in the final occupation layers. Desperate measures, changes in diet, signs of malnutrition. Instead, the abandonment seems almost orderly, like people made a decision to leave and carried through with it. There's another possibility, quieter, less discussed. Maybe Los Milares wasn't abandoned because of internal failure. Maybe it was because the world around it changed. The early Bronze Age was beginning. New technologies, new power structures, new trade routes. Maybe Los Milares, for all its wealth and sophistication, simply became irrelevant. The walls still stand, partially, eroded by 4,000 years of wind and rain. The bastions are crumbling. The outposts are barely visible, but the mystery remains intact. Deep in the Orăști Mountains of Romania, hidden among forests and steep ridges, there's a fortress that Rome couldn't ignore, Sarmizegetusa Regia, the capital of the Dacian kingdom, a mountain stronghold so formidable it took the full might of the Roman Empire 2 campaigns to bring it down. And even then, after the conquest, after the destruction, the Romans never fully understood what they'd found, because Sarmizegetusa wasn't just a military installation, it was something more, something that still doesn't quite make sense. The Dacians were a Thracian people who controlled much of what's now Romania and parts of Hungary. They spoke a language that's extinct now, left behind almost no written records. What we know about them comes mostly from their enemies, Greek historians, Roman generals, and the ruins themselves. Sarmizegetusa sits at about 4,000 feet elevation, accessible only by narrow mountain paths that wind through dense forest, natural defensive position. But the Dacians weren't content with geography alone. They built walls, massive rectangular blocks of limestone fitted together without mortar, using a technique called murus dacicus. The stones are cut with such precision that you can barely slip a knife blade between them. The walls are backed with timber and rubble, creating a composite structure that's both flexible and incredibly strong. Flexible enough to absorb the impact of battering rams, strong enough to withstand siege engines. The Romans found that out the hard way. Emperor Trajan invaded Dacia in 101 AD. 2 legions, auxiliary forces, the best military machine in the ancient world, and the Dacians held them off. The campaign ended in a negotiated peace, not a Roman victory. Trajan went home, built a monument celebrating his triumph. But the Dacians kept their capital. It took another invasion 5 years later with even more troops to finally break through. And when the Romans did, they found something unexpected. The fortress covered roughly 70 acres, but it wasn't all military. There were residential areas, workshops, storage facilities, and temples. Multiple sanctuaries built with the same precision as the defensive walls. One of them, the main temple, is circular, about 60 feet in diameter, made from massive blocks of andesite, a volcanic rock that's difficult to work. The floor is paved. The walls, what remains of them, show careful construction, precise angles, but it's the arrangement that catches your attention. The temple sits at the center of a complex of smaller sanctuaries and what appear to be astronomical observation points. Wooden pillars arranged in circular patterns, markers that may have tracked the sun's movement, the winter solstice, the equinoxes. The Dacians, according to classical sources, had a religious elite called the Tarabostes, priest nobles, men who combined spiritual authority with political power, and they were studying the sky. That's clear from the layout. But why? Religious reasons, certainly. Most ancient cultures tied their gods to celestial movements, but there may have been practical considerations too. Agriculture, determining when to plant, when to harvest. For a mountain people living at high elevation with a short growing season, getting the timing right would have been critical. The Romans destroyed it all. After the final siege in 106 AD, they systematically dismantled Sarmizegetusa Regia, knocked down the walls, burned the buildings. The temples were abandoned, deliberately desecrated. The population was killed or enslaved. Dacia became a Roman province, and the capital was moved to a new city in the lowlands, Sarmizegetusa Ulpia Traiana. The old mountain fortress was left to rot. But here's the strange part. Even in ruins, the site maintained a presence. Later inhabitants, probably Romanized Dacians, continued to visit the temples. There's evidence of ritual activity well into the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. People were still coming to this abandoned, partially destroyed site to perform ceremonies, to honor gods whose names we don't even know. What makes Sarmizegetusa Regia so frustrating is how little the Dacians left behind in terms of written records. We have a few words, proper names mostly, preserved in Greek and Latin texts. We have Trajan's column in Rome, with its spiral relief depicting the Dacian wars. But the column shows the war through Roman eyes, Roman propaganda. The Dacians appear as noble savages, brave but doomed. Their culture reduced to visual stereotypes. The archaeology tells a more complex story. The precision of the construction, the integration of religious and military functions, the astronomical knowledge. These weren't primitive mountain tribes. The Dacians had engineers, architects, a sophisticated understanding of both defensive warfare and celestial mechanics. And they had gold, lots of it. The mountains around Sarmizegetusa were rich in gold deposits, and the Dacians had been mining them for centuries. That's probably what attracted Roman attention in the first place. Not strategic concerns, not barbarian raids, just gold. After the conquest, Trajan hauled an estimated 500,000 pounds of gold and 1 million pounds of silver back to Rome, enough to fund building projects across the empire for decades. So maybe that's the real mystery of Sarmizegetusa. Not why it fell, but why it stood as long as it did. A mountain kingdom sitting on a fortune in precious metals, surrounded by empires that wanted those resources. The Dacians held out for centuries, built their temples, studied their stars, fortified their mountains, until Rome decided the cost of conquest was worth paying. Walk through the ruins today, and you can still see the precision. The cut stones, the temple foundations, the mountain mist drifts through what used to be sacred spaces. Eagles circle overhead. The forests have reclaimed most of it. But the stones remember, even if they're not telling. In West Africa, stretching across what is now Gambia and Senegal, there are stone circles, over 1,000 of them, spread across more than 12,000 square miles of savanna and woodland. They're called the Stone Circles of Senegambia, and they represent the largest concentration of stone circles anywhere in the world, more than Stonehenge, more than Avebury, more than any megalithic site in Europe. And yet most people have never heard of them. The circles vary in size. Some contain just 10 stones, others have 24 or more. The stones themselves are laterite, a type of iron-rich sedimentary rock common in tropical regions. They're shaped into rough cylinders, anywhere from 3 to 8 feet tall, weighing up to 10 tons each. Each circle is precisely laid out, the stones evenly spaced, creating nearly perfect geometric patterns. And there are so many of them, clusters scattered across the landscape, sometimes a dozen circles in a single location, other times just one or two standing alone in the bush. The most famous site is Wasu in central Gambia, 11 circles containing a total of 54 stones. The largest stone there is about 8 feet tall and weighs close to 10 tons. Stand in the center of one of these circles and you feel the weight of it. The deliberate arrangement. Someone put enormous effort into hauling these stones, shaping them, setting them upright. And they did it over and over again, 1,000 times. But here's what we know about who built them. Almost nothing. The archaeological evidence suggests the circles were constructed between the 3rd century BC and the 16th century AD. That's a huge span. Almost 2,000 years, which means this wasn't a single culture or a brief burst of activity. This was a tradition, generations upon generations, maintaining the practice of building stone circles. And we know their burial sites. Excavations have found human remains buried within and around the circles, sometimes individual burials, sometimes multiple individuals in a single grave. The bodies were usually laid in an east-west orientation. No cremation, no elaborate coffins, just bodies placed in the earth, sometimes with grave goods, iron tools, pottery, beads, nothing extravagant, but enough to suggest these weren't paupers' graves. But that's where the certainty ends, because who was buried in these circles? Kings, priests, warriors, or were they communal graves, reserved for entire families or clans? The physical evidence doesn't tell us. The skeletal remains haven't revealed any obvious patterns in age, sex, or social status. Some circles contain the bones of children, others only adults. There's no consistency. And then there's the question of why. Why circles? Why laterite? Why this specific arrangement of stones? Other African cultures built tombs, pyramids in Nubia and Egypt, rock-cut chambers in Ethiopia, earthen mounds across the Sahel. But these people chose circles, precise, carefully measured circles. Some researchers have suggested astronomical alignments, that certain circles mark the solstices or equinoxes. There are examples of stones positioned to catch the first light of dawn on specific days. But not all circles show this. Many seem to have no astronomical significance whatsoever. So if some circles were calendars and others weren't, what does that mean? Were different circles built for different purposes? Or did the purposes change over time? There's also the question of scale. Building even a single circle would have required significant labor, quarrying the laterite, shaping the stones with iron tools, transporting them to the site, digging the pits, raising the stones upright. You're talking about dozens of people working for weeks, and they did this 1,000 times across 2 countries over nearly 2 millennia. That suggests organization, centralized authority maybe, or a widely shared religious belief strong enough to motivate communities to invest enormous resources in these projects. But we have no written records from the cultures that built the circles, no oral traditions that clearly explain their purpose. The modern populations in Gambia and Senegal have their own interpretations, but these are largely speculative, passed down through generations that lost the original meaning centuries ago. What's particularly striking is that the tradition eventually stopped. The last circles were built sometime in the 16th century, around the time European contact with West Africa was increasing. The Portuguese arrived. The Atlantic slave trade began. Societies were disrupted. Power structures changed. And the stone circles, whatever they meant, were no longer built. But they weren't destroyed either. There's no evidence of deliberate vandalism, no Christian missionaries toppling pagan monuments. The circles were simply left standing, abandoned. Local populations didn't maintain them, but they didn't tear them down either. The stones just stood there, weathering slowly in the tropical climate, gradually being swallowed by vegetation. It wasn't until the 19th century that European explorers started documenting them. And it wasn't until the late 20th century that serious archaeological work began. UNESCO designated 4 of the major sites as World Heritage Sites in 2006. Finally, international recognition. But recognition doesn't equal understanding. The stone circles of Senegambia remain enigmatic. We can date them. We can measure them. We can excavate the graves and analyze the bones. But we can't know what they meant to the people who built them. We can't hear the ceremonies that must have accompanied the burials. We can't understand the cosmology that motivated such sustained effort over such a long period. The circles stand in the savannah, some leaning, some still perfectly upright. The laterite has darkened with age. The land around them is cultivated now. Millet fields, peanut crops. Life continues as it always has, but the stones watch, silent witnesses to something we've lost. We've traveled from the tropical islands of Tonga to the wind-battered cliffs of Ireland, from the Mediterranean coastlines to the mountains of Romania, from the Neolithic villages of Cyprus to the stone circles of West Africa. Different cultures, different time periods, different continents, and yet they all share something. They all present us with evidence that challenges our assumptions about the ancient world. These weren't primitive people stumbling through the darkness of prehistory. They were engineers, astronomers, architects. They moved stones weighing dozens of tons without machinery. They aligned structures with celestial events, using nothing but observation and patience. They built defenses against threats we can't identify. They honored their dead in ways we can't fully comprehend. And they did it all without leaving us an instruction manual. That's what makes these sites so compelling. We can measure them, date them, excavate them, but we can't know them. Not completely. The Ha'amonga and Maui Trilathon still holds its secrets about whether it tracked the sun or marked royal power. Laquimada's blackened stones won't say whether the burning was attack or ritual. The Nuraghi of Sardinia stand silent about whether they were fortresses or temples or something we haven't even considered. Khirokitia's buried dead, with their weighted stones and missing skulls, raise questions about beliefs we can only guess at. Dún Aengus perches on its cliff, defended by thousands of stone stakes against an enemy that may never have come. Los Millares shows us wealth and sophistication in a time when neither should have existed. Sarmizegetusa Regia proved that even Rome's legions could be held at bay by people the Romans called barbarians, and the stone circles of Senegambia stretch across the landscape, a tradition maintained for 2,000 years, then abandoned without explanation. These aren't the monuments that make it into the textbooks. They're not as famous as the pyramids or as iconic as Stonehenge, but in some ways, that makes them more important, because they remind us how much we don't know. How many civilizations rose and fell without leaving written records? How many achievements were forgotten? How many questions remain unanswered? Archaeology is detective work without all the evidence. We find fragments, pieces, clues that sometimes point in contradictory directions, and we do our best to assemble them into narratives that make sense. But the ancient world doesn't always cooperate. Sometimes the stones just stand there, silent, stubborn, keeping their secrets. Maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Maybe the not knowing is what keeps us looking, keeps us asking questions, keeps us humble about how much remains to be discovered. Because for every site we've explored tonight, there are dozens more, hundreds, scattered across every continent, hiding in forests, buried under cities, weathering away on mountaintops, waiting for someone to find them, to excavate them, to try to understand. The past isn't dead. It's not even past, as someone once said. It's right there, in the stones, in the foundations, in the walls and tombs and circles, speaking a language we're still learning to hear. Sleep well. And when you wake up, remember, the world is stranger than we think, older, more complex, full of mysteries that shouldn't exist, but they do. If you found yourself drawn into these mysteries, if you stayed with us through all 7 sites, do us a favor, hit that like button. Share this with someone who appreciates a good mystery. Someone who understands that history isn't just dates and names. It's questions, puzzles, stories that don't have endings yet. And maybe, just maybe, subscribe. Because there are more mysteries out there, more sites that defy explanation, more stories that need telling. The ancient world is waiting.